In one of the sunny dreams in the desert, a black-haired man with a small beard fought a small group of attackers. When he finished with the latter, he still felt strange because he felt an unprecedented evil energy, and it was felt behind him. It took the man just a few minutes of concentrated thought to figure out who he was. They were two young men named Changwan and Quanwan, who folded their hands as if in prayer and thanked Dokupei for defeating the demons. However, the gentleman put his hands to his sides and began to smile out loud because he did not believe in the sincerity of the words of the two young men standing in front of him. The boys were angry and began to reproach Doc P, who in turn emphasized that as soon as he defeated the demons, they immediately stood behind him. The young men then decided to explain that they had no personal animosity toward the gentleman, but would simply take his life for Miriam's peace of mind. The man sneeringly emphasized that they probably had never heard of how to pinch an opponent because they left him an opportunity to attack. One of the young men took out his sword and jumped high up and began to fall right next to his opponent, saying that he was too confident. While he was descending, he simultaneously used the magic of thunderstorm peaks, which did not take long to work, and everything around him was covered in white lightning. Doc P stood there calmly, saying that it was quite noisy and that working with peaks was very tiring and took a lot of energy. As soon as the young man landed on the ground, there was a lot of dust around, but he still pointed his sword in the direction of his opponent and thought he had caught him. But it didn't happen the way he imagined, because Doc P was holding the sharp end of a weapon that was supposed to kill him, and it scared him. At the same time, the other tried to sneak in to help his partner defeat the opponent and end it once and for all. However, he managed to push the two self-confident insolents a few meters away with just 2 fingers of his right hand. They didn't want to give up so easily, so the more powerful one decided to use the 9 tiger fist technique against the man. Doc P, seeing all this, emphasized that both of them were using 2 noisy techniques to fight the opponent. This made the young man very angry, and he shouted at the man to shut up and at the same time struck him directly in the chest. This caused the black-haired gentleman to fly back a few meters, and when he came to, he said that this time it was quite powerful. After that, the 2 young men decided to attack the man at the same time to prevent him from being able to fight back. Doc P was a little amused by this courage and told them to give it a little more strength and show him the full power of the young masters. Not only were these guys already angry, but these words made them even angrier, and one of them again ordered his opponent to shut up. After these words, the gentleman decided that it was enough to watch the futile efforts of these young men and climbed high up to show his full strength. A few seconds later, a powerful explosion occurred that even shook the ground and sent a large cloud of dust into the air. The attackers at this time did their best to at least stay on their feet, so as soon as it was over, they were breathing heavily. Then a man appeared in front of them again, spreading his arms to the sides and smiling, asking if they were tired. The guys raised their eyebrows in anger, first mentally called the opponent a monster, and then wondered if a person could be so strong. Then they mentioned that this gentleman did not even have a weapon to fight them, and the only chance to defeat him was when he was floating in the air. Suddenly, Doc P noticed a small cut on his little finger that scared him very much, and even sweat broke out on his forehead from excitement. Holding his wounded arm carefully, he opened his mouth wide and asked the young men how they dared to leave a mark on his body. And only after this incident did he reach for his sword and pull it out, emphasizing that in this case, childish games were over. A second later, he added that it was time to fight for real. The boys were scared because the gentleman's sword looked like it was not sharpened, and they were right to be afraid of it, because Doc P was able to deal with 2 guys at the same time with just 1 sword stroke, and he found it boring. 10 years had passed since that battle, and the gray-haired man was sitting in a lotus position under the waterfall, his eyes closed, thinking about something. He recalled that from the very beginning, he picked up a sword in order to survive. The master traveled the world and crushed many masters. He managed to defeat everyone as one, and more than once, he found himself on the edge of life and death. But thanks to this, he was able to become stronger. At that time, no one could stop him because he was the only one who was undefeated, and he thought he could command many people. But because of this, he was mired in emptiness. And in order to get out of it, the man came to this place, and after staying here, he was able to find the answer. Then Doc P opened his eyes, and his long gray hair stood up, because at that moment, he realized that he had reached a level that could not be raised on the ground. The martial arts are over, and now he must become a celestial to reach the highest level and fully realize himself. In the end, he was happy that he was able to succeed, and he did so after 10 years of greatly limiting himself and his desires. Then the man's soul went up high into the mountain, and heading for the clouds, said that now it was going there to become a heavenly dweller. After that, the soul rushed headlong to the appointed place, leaving behind a gray trail in the sky. The birds flying by were surprised and frightened by this. Suddenly, a group of large faces appeared in front of the gray-haired man, formed from the clouds, and addressed him and ordered him to stop. This did not frighten the gentleman, but instead he smilingly told him that his name was Ha-Hu Yen, and from now on he would be a new heavenly resident. The faces listened attentively and began to cite facts from the man's past, one by one, that made it impossible for him to live with them in heaven. The man was very surprised and saddened by this information, but the heavenly inhabitants decided to give him another chance to wash away his sins of the past. Huyen angrily asked, who decided not to let him through now because he had suffered so much on his way up here. So he raised his eyebrows and ordered them to make room for him, but their faces realized that this soul did not even understand the words. Therefore, they have only one way left, namely, to send her to Earth by force, so that she can correct her past mistakes. And in a matter of seconds, they all simultaneously began to blow directly on the gray-haired soul in order to move it back to the place from which it came. However, even during such a strong airflow, the man managed to hold on, and the Celestials emphasized that he was quite stubborn. One of the men was tired of this showdown, so he angrily emphasized that they had explained everything clearly to him and at the same time was preparing something to hit. It was a large and heavy fireplace that should have brought this impudent soul down, but they managed to break the barrier and stayed in place. The Celestials were shocked, to put it mildly, by how stubborn this gray-haired man was and began to wonder where such people came from. Then the face of a baby appeared in front of the man, and a small amount of saliva was released from its small mouth. It completely wrapped around Ha Huyen, and within seconds he was staring at it because he couldn't breathe improperly and it scared him. Later, the baby pulled the air toward him, and this saliva began to dissolve in the air, thus allowing the soul to breathe. However, the celestial inhabitants still managed to throw the gray-haired man out of the sky, and he was furious about it and promised to return. Doc P felt as if he was deep underwater and needed to immediately gather his strength to get out of this trap. Suddenly, when he opened his eyes, he saw a young girl who was happy that he had regained consciousness and immediately asked him if he was okay. The young lady nervously emphasized that the gentleman had caused her a lot of trouble because of what had happened to him, while Doc P did not understand where he was or what had happened. A few seconds later, the man raised his hands up and was surprised to see that they looked so white and swollen, even though they had not been before. Then, he began to investigate his interlocutor not too carefully, saying that if he was looking for something, he could ask her. Without saying anything, the man quickly went to the mirror and was very surprised to see a young, handsome man standing in his reflection. At first, the young man could not understand who he was in the reflection and why he looked so young. But then he looked into his mouth and saw many teeth. Then a strange anger came over the young man, and out of excitement he fell sharply to the ground, not thinking what could have happened to him. The young lady who was standing behind him at the time was frightened and emphasized that the gentleman should not exert himself so much because he had not yet fully recovered. When she approached the young man to help him up, he asked her who she was and why she was with him. The girl was a little embarrassed by this reaction, but she said that her name was Kim Chom-san and added that she was helping her son and young family, Nam Gun. The young man asked if Nam Gun's family lived here, and in response, he heard both agreement and concern for what he still could not remember. The young man quickly got to his feet and asked who he was. The girl was angry and said that he was the second son of the family, Nam Gun Haek. From this information, the guy almost fainted and therefore fell to his knees, thinking that this simply could not be true and that he must be dreaming. Then the young man with wide eyes grabbed his interlocutor by both hands and asked her what time she was in. The young lady said that it was the 70th year of the Union, because that is how long it had been since the founding of the Cheonchong Union. After putting her second son on the bed, the lady hurried to the exit to bring a doctor to help. At this time, the shocked guy with his mouth wide open was thinking that he was already 80 years old when this union was founded. And it turns out that the ascent was unsuccessful. He fell and suddenly 60 years flew by, in which case his real age is 150 years. The young man still could not believe what had happened and decided to analyze everything again, and concluded that the celestial inhabitants had decided to make fun of him in this way. In his rage, he shouted loudly that it was not enough for them to stop the climb, that they decided to make a joke out of it. The only question that remains unanswered is why they decided to send him here and what he has to do or fix in this place. The guy was simply out of his mind with rage, and there was no point in trying to find out anything because all his fighting skills that he had been training all his life had simply disappeared. He went from one extreme to the other. He did not believe in himself, or he was happy that he had a different body, and all his memories and experiences were still with him. Smiling loudly, he said to himself that he was the one who had started from the bottom and made it to the top, and this time he would be able to do the same. But first, he needs to get out of here to find out who this gun heck is, since he is the son of the Nam gun family. The young man decided not to postpone his escape for a long time and immediately went out into the courtyard, where he looked around and decided that no one was guarding the building. After walking a few meters and looking around one of the corners of the building, I noticed two guards talking to each other. At first, the guy did not understand what he should do. Go the other way, or just meet with these guards and destroy them. After a few minutes of thinking, the young man decided that he did not need to go after people on the first day of rebirth, and therefore just needed to run quickly. Then the fugitive noticed a small fence and decided that he just needed to concentrate and could run over it in one jerk. Without waiting long, he began to exert maximum effort to fulfill his plan, but it was not as easy as he had imagined. For some reason, he was unable to make the leap, even though he had used all his strength and skills from his past life to do so. Feeling himself up, the young man suggested that it might be because he had not yet gotten used to his new young body and did not fully know how to use it. So he decided to try once again to concentrate and use all the power he had, and that's why white light began to appear around him. Suddenly, his concentration was interrupted by a strange sound of broken bones, and turning his head back, the young man tried to understand what had happened. And what he saw next surprised and frightened him, because as it turned out, one of his legs was broken and turned in the opposite direction. In pain, he fell to the ground and, holding his leg, began to shout loudly that he was in pain, and at that time, two assistants hurried to him. Bandaging the leg, the doctor emphasized that the good thing is that the fracture is quite simple and the man will be able to recover quickly, but he must not forget to take his medications. The assistants were standing by the victim's bedside at the time, telling him to follow the doctor's advice and not to think about making any more rash jumps. However, the guy did not hear any of this because he was thinking how he could break his leg so easily, since he did not even have time to do anything. It was because of this misunderstanding that the young man demanded an explanation of his position, and the assistant said that he did not have enough energy for such tricks. The assistant burst into tears of emotion and asked him not to strain himself because he might die, and then she would do it too, out of guilt. The second son did not want to listen to this, and ordered them both to leave his room in an angry tone because he wanted to be alone. The servants were in no hurry to leave the room because at first they wanted their master to drink the medicine prescribed by the doctor, but he began to swing a pillow at them. However, after this movement, the boy felt pain in his shoulder, and one of the assistants suggested that it could be a sign of dislocation, so he should be careful. As soon as everyone left the room and the blonde boy was alone, he began to think that the second son should have a base by now. So first, he decided to find out why this young man was so weak, so he sat down in the lotus position and closed his eyes. In a matter of seconds, a white light appeared above the guy's head, which helped to find out that all 9 energy flows were blocked. This means that it is an incurable disease in which the yin energy clogs the streams, and because of this, patients cannot survive the age of 20 and usually disappear. The young man began to smile nervously at this information because he could no longer control his feelings normally because of this news. Then he exploded again and raised his head up and loudly asked the celestial inhabitants why they did this to him, what he had done wrong. After thinking it over for a few minutes, the guy clenched his hand tightly into fists and said out loud that those who made him go through this would pay for it. Suddenly, the young man felt a sharp pain again, but this time in his arm, and as it turned out, one of his bones broke again. Holding his injured limb carefully, the young man turned to those who might be outside the room and asked to call the doctor again. While putting a cast on his arm, the doctor said that the guy should take care of himself because his body is very delicate and it is possible that one careless hand could cause a crack. This time, the second son did not shout at the assistants, but simply said that he understood everything and asked them to leave his room. Left alone in the room, the boy thought about how he used to crush his opponents like ants. And now, it's a lot of work for him to give away ants. However, this did not upset him for a second, because if there are difficulties on the way, you cannot give up, and this has been a principle of Doc P's for many years. Then the young man realized that he had only two ways to pass this test: the technique of light heart flow and the technique of filling with energy. And if he can still apply these two methods, the 9 energy flows of yin will seem like a ridiculous problem. Then the young man suggested that after defeating the 9 yin energy flows, he might be able to gain such a fighting power that even Doc P had never dreamed of. A few hours later, an assistant came to the door of the room and loudly addressed the man and told him that it was time to take his medication. In response, she heard nothing and assumed that the young man might have gone to bed, which was wrong, because you need to go to bed after taking medicine. That is why she decided that she could afford to enter the room without permission, and what she saw when she entered frightened her. It turned out that her husband was bleeding from the head, and he was sitting quietly with his eyes closed in the lotus position and did not pay attention to it. At first, the girl did not know what to do, so she ran up to the guy and covered the wound with her hand, but later she could not do it for long. A few hours later, the blonde young man woke up in bed and realized that his entire body was bandaged and he could not make any free movement. The assistant who had been by his side all this time leaned low to his face and asked him excitedly why he had decided to do something irreparable. The victim did not answer because he was thinking that he had just started to control his energy and had become disabled because of it. Because of this, tears began to flow from the guy's eyes, which he first called drops of sweat, but later admitted that they were bloody tears full of anger and resentment. The assistant did not want to listen to this nonsense any longer, so she put an expensive medicine called Cheongin into the gentleman's mouth. Hearing this name, the young man asked if this was the potion of the man who gave 10 years of energy, and the young lady replied that she did not have such information. A few minutes after swallowing this potion, the blonde man felt a great surge of energy and was even able to sit up on his own. However, the effect was short-lived because the medication worked at first, but then everything came back, and so the guy was forced to go back to bed. Lying with his back to the assistant, the man said that he had drunk the best potion to restore his energy and could not even draw water from the well. The young man cried without holding back his tears and promised himself that he would definitely correct this injustice, no matter what it took. The assistant didn't know what she could do, so she decided to leave the room and finally wished him a good rest and a speedy recovery. However, as soon as she touched the door handle, the young man asked her where they kept the books on martial arts. The young lady did not expect to receive such a question because the guy had never been interested in such things before, and this reaction angered her interlocutor. He even allowed himself to shout at her, and the girl was very upset by this behavior and almost burst into tears in front of him. A few days passed, and the second son began to recover gradually, and during the treatment, he realized that he needed to learn a new fighting technique. He was so excited about the new equipment that he went to the window and opened the door to get some fresh air. However, the air that rushed in from the street seemed rather cold to him, and he quickly hid under the covers on the bed. Wrapped up from head to toe, he was furious that because of these 9 energy flows of yin, even an ordinary cool breeze pierced him to the bone. So, after a few minutes of thinking, the guy decided that if he went wrapped in a blanket, he would feel much better and warmer. After taking a few steps, the young man was forced to kneel down and pray for a while, and then stop altogether because the blanket seemed heavy. This made him very angry again because he used to be able to move freely wherever he wanted, and now even basic things are difficult for him. It took a whole day for the guy to be able to go outside, and all this time he was sewing warm clothes for himself. When he approached the Namgung family library, its building seemed quite grand, and surely it had a lot of useful literature. Then he remembered how in his past life he had gone fishing with a member of this family, and he had boasted about this library. At first, the man did not understand why they were so proud of it, but the interlocutor explained that it preserved their 1,000-year history. At the time, the blonde gentleman thought this fellow was rather strange, because as soon as the conversation turned to his family, he seemed to lose his mind and reality. And then it's hard to stop him, because as soon as he gets the slightest opportunity, he can talk for hours about his family and its heritage. Doc P didn't want to hear it, especially while he was fishing, so he raised his fist to his friend's face and asked if he would shut up or if he needed help. After a few moments of silence, the man, holding onto his fishing rod, asked his interlocutor why not a single fish had bitten yet. Now the young man realized that this friend was certainly not perfect, but he was not bad at all, and his only drawback was that he talked too much. This library was guarded by two soldiers who, as soon as they saw someone approaching them, put their swords forward to prevent anyone from getting closer. The young man was shocked that a warrior could point a weapon at him so easily, and he gritted his teeth in anger. And then he decided that he would not explain anything to them, but would simply deal with them as he saw fit, and skipped the intermediate ones. When he was behind the guards, he swung his arm, which was still bandaged, and struck the two men directly on the heads to knock them down. The warriors fell face first into the ground, and the young man said that there had never been anyone who could survive after being hit by a sword. However, in a matter of seconds, the young man came to and realized that everything that had just happened was just his imagination, and he was still standing in front of the two guards. During this time, one of the guards said that they did not recognize him at all in the dark, and quickly apologized for their rudeness. The guy himself just realized that he was the second son of a respectable family, so he said that everything was fine and anything could happen. The guards had never seen this young man here before, so one of them decided to report this appearance to the chief so that he would know about it just in case. Slowly opening the door to the room, the young man entered it, and what he saw shocked him because there were a lot of books on the shelves. With his mouth wide open, the young man stood looking around for a few more seconds and then said that he felt like there were some cool secrets hidden here. So without thinking twice, he decided that he would spend tonight here reading various books to gain new knowledge. The second son of a respectable family spent the whole night in the library but found nothing useful and therefore questioned whether this family was the best. The figure of the king of the sword, who had deceived him with his stories about the greatness and knowledge of this library, came to mind again. The blond man got angry again because he hadn't been able to find anything worthwhile during the whole night, so he started throwing books in different directions. However, suddenly his heart was pounding, and it made him calm down to sit down and remember that these energy flows do not allow him to exist normally. And if he doesn't solve the problem with this energy, the first person he sees will be the god of death, Yama, not the Celestials, and he can't afford that. So then the young man decided to return to his room to get some rest, because he was very tired after sleeping all night and had a headache. But what happened next brought him to his senses very quickly because someone on his right side called him a milksucker so loudly that he even fell over. Looking at the figure moving toward him, the boy could not understand who it was and why it was addressing him so loudly. The burly man was not in the mood to explain anything at first. Instead, he put both his hands to his sides and called the boy a milkman again. And only a second later, he added that he had previously forbidden him to enter the library, taking care of his health and his condition in general. Two assistants with medical education intervened in the fight and addressed the head of the family and warned him that the young man had not yet fully recovered. It was only after these words that the young man began to analyze and realized that this man was the most important person here, which meant that he was his father. However, the warning did not work on the man. He was still very angry and asked everyone to leave because he had to deal with it properly and not like a daddy. After these words, all those present turned in the opposite direction and began to walk away, because who are they to disobey the order of the chief? As soon as there was no one on the horizon, the man clenched his hands tightly into fists and approached his son, hugged him tightly, and held him close. Then he pushed himself away and looked him in the eye and asked what he was thinking when he entered the library, because his body was like a big ice cube. The father was worried that his son was very cold, and such a reaction further encouraged the boy's thoughts that this man was a complete fool and that he could take advantage of him. So he turned to his dad with a scrunched up face and said that he needed only two things: a potion to boost his energy and a technique that suited him. Gently hugging the young man by the shoulders, the gentleman said that he did not have to worry about the potion, although it was in short supply, but he would do his best. But there are problems with the secret technique because his body has not been able to accept martial arts since childhood, and any fatigue can kill him. The guy folded his arms as if in prayer and pitifully said that he would die sooner or later, so he should not give up without even trying. The father, with a sad expression on his face, calmly replied that he could allow his son to do anything he wanted, but not martial arts. The young man was upset and angry at the same time because this boss was stubborn and he wanted to hit him, but first he decided to change his tactics. The father held out his hand to his son and told him to stop resisting, and they finally went to rest, but he began to cough loudly, which scared the gentleman. Then the boy made a face as if he was dizzy and about to faint, and his father had to catch him to prevent him from falling. When their eyes crossed, the young man turned to his father with a frowning expression and emphasized that he could die at any second. So he tried again to ask to be allowed to learn about the technique theoretically, and in return, he would not learn martial arts in practice. The man was very touched by these words, and even cried a little because he was sorry that his child had to go through such a thing. After a little rest, the young man changed his clothes and went outside when the sun was shining, and realized that he was not cold at all during the day, and could walk freely. Walking to another building, which was smaller than the previous one, the young man thought that it would be nice to see something useful here. Opening the door and looking around, the young man realized that inside, everything was not very different from the Changchong library. The thought flashed through my mind that there are secret techniques that can only be used by those who are related by blood to the head of the Namgung family. The young man again stayed in the library late into the night and had to light a flashlight to continue reading. In a whole day and part of the night, he managed to read almost all the volumes of the books, and from them, he learned 5 new techniques that he could use later. The disadvantage was that this knowledge was not enough to create a martial art that would be suitable for his body, so he needed to find some spiritual technique. Suddenly, the young man felt a sharp pain in his stomach, and he realized that his body had no strength, but it could get hungry, so he decided that he needed to eat. Taking the first step through the books to the exit, the young man tripped over one and flew face down right into all the other textbooks. Again, he was angry because he had to be in this body, which could not even coordinate its movements properly. Lying face down, the second son noticed that one of the slabs in the floor was protruding, which could indicate that something might be under it. At first, he tried to lift it with his hands, but he failed, so he decided to use a large stick, and within a few minutes, he succeeded. At first, there was a lot of dust around, and it took a few minutes for it to settle and the inscription on the slab below to be visible. Then the young man returned to his room and began to eat. The assistant was shocked by his appetite, as he had never had one before. Smiling happily, she said that it was the first time she had ever seen him eat something with such an appetite, because before he could take a long time to eat before a meal. Having eaten everything, the guy put his foot down and said to his assistant that it was all because of his insatiable appetite, because he could not afford it. The young lady raised her right hand to her chin and thought about these words and could not understand what her master meant by saying this to her. Instead, the young man, walking across the room, interrupted all these thoughts of his assistant and ordered her to remove all the dishes from his table because he would not eat anymore. When he was left alone in the room, he realized that his stomach was already full, so now he could start what he had wanted to do for a long time, and he sat down in the lotus position. The assistant was returning to her apartment in the evening and noticed someone behind her and decided to look closely to see who it was. And there she saw the eldest heir standing silently by one of the windows of the building, watching what was happening inside. A few seconds later, he turned in the opposite direction and began to walk slowly, and the assistant noticed that he had brought the strengthening potion again. The girl said to herself that this elder heir also did not know how to express his feelings, and if he was so worried, he could have gone inside. At this time, the second son of a respectable family was deep in thought and trying to figure out how to combine all his knowledge to get the equipment just for him. After a few minutes of these reflections, an image of his personality from his past life emerged in the young man's mind. This silhouette came to my heart, and at that moment, I thought that the best thing would be a harmony between the mixed celestial force and the technique of Changchong. And in order for all this to work, you need to cleanse the dark energy and add clean energy so that you can try something. It turned out to be a rather difficult task that required a lot of strength and energy, and the young man began to be covered with droplets of fine sweat. At this time, an assistant had already come to the door of the room and was rehearsing the speech she would say when she entered, but suddenly felt a strange warmth. A second later, she flew a few meters back from the blast wave, and all the food she had brought flew in different directions. When all the dust settled, she looked closely and noticed that her master was still sitting on the bed in the lotus position, with his eyes tightly closed. The assistant was seriously frightened, so she quickly got to her feet and began to run to the gentleman to bring him to his senses and talk about what had happened. However, he did not respond to any calls and shouts at all. It was as if he was in his own reality, where no one from the outside world could reach him. They immediately decided to inform his father about what had happened, who reacted quite sharply to the news and became very worried about it. The assistant began to apologize for what had happened because she was supposed to constantly monitor the gentleman, but she failed to do so. My father said that he needed to go to Heck immediately to help, but he was stopped by the eldest heir, who emphasized that now was not the time to do so. The assistant decided to support the words of the elder heir and added that the doctor also said that he still had to stabilize. His father did not know how to react to such words, because it looked like Heck had found something in the books in the library and ended up creating problems for himself. After a short pause, the head plunged into his thoughts and said out loud that it was his mistake because he was so worried about his son's health. The next day, early in the morning, the second son was pushing himself up from the floor and thinking that out of 9 energy flows, he could hardly break through one. Because of this, he was able to extinguish a large fire, but if he cannot create a technique that is suitable for spiritual techniques, then all his efforts are in vain. Then the young man began to think about what he could call this new technique, and in a matter of seconds, came up with the name of the Dark King's Chan Chong technique. At that moment, the doctor's assistant and the father entered the room, and they were shocked, to say the least, because it looked like some kind of healing. The young man did not like this assumption that he would be healed, because it takes a lot of strength and energy to push himself off the floor like that. At the end of the next set, the young man sat on the floor and held one hand, emphasizing that his body was still giving some resistance. The father could not believe his eyes, so he turned to his interlocutors and asked if this was really happening, or if he was dreaming. Then the doctor came up to Heck, took his wrist, and emphasized that the energy flows became wider and stronger, and the pulse became clearer. The young man wiped his face with a handkerchief from sweat and said that was why he told them that he was fine, because he knew his own body. After these words, his father came up to the boy and grabbed him in his arms and began to hug him with joy, saying out loud that he was proud of his son. The head of the family continued to smile broadly, saying that he did not know what his second son had done, but he was very happy that he was feeling better. At the end of this sentence, the boy turned to his father and suggested that after such a strong hug, he felt like his shoulders were broken. At first, the head was frightened, but then he turned his face to the doctor and demanded to know why he said that his son was on the mend. The man was covered with sweat from excitement, but he explained that he had started healing from the 9 energy flows, but it did not affect his body. Dad started scratching his head and looking around the room, and then said that he had forgotten about the urgent meeting of the elders. The assistant turned to the head and added that no meetings were scheduled for today, and the gentleman angrily replied that she could not know about it. At the door, the man stopped and turned to his son and told him that he was going to take care of some urgent business and wished him a speedy recovery. The young man did not like this reaction because, in his opinion, his father had messed up with his hug and just left him with this problem. Suddenly, a second later, the father reappeared in the doorway looking at his son, and he decided to wish his son patience and a speedy recovery. Heck then opened his mouth wide and shouted loudly to his guests to return his shoulders to their previous position so that he could stand up properly. It took a month for the guy to fully recover from the unsuccessful hug, and he was even able to start jogging on a path across a small lake. The assistant, who tried to constantly monitor the man's health, could not count how many laps he had already run. She informed her friend of her concern about her second son's condition, because after being ill a month ago, he woke up as if he were a different person. The interlocutor, with his hand over his mouth, began to smile mysteriously and suggested that perhaps this gentleman had changed showers with someone for the sake of feeling so good. Suddenly, they realized that they could not see the gentleman who was supposed to be running along the path they had been watching. The assistant's worst thoughts were already running through her head, but when they started looking for him around, they noticed that he was underwater nearby. The friend began to reassure the young lady, saying that the depth of this lake was too shallow to drown, so it was simply theoretically impossible. Holding her head, the girl realized that her lord so often breaks his body and gets into various troubles that it looks like her nerves are out of place. Around lunchtime, a market is set up on one of the streets of the town, where a mother buys a big red lollipop for her little girl. However, the girl didn't even have time to taste it because Heck met her on the road and simply took the candy from the child without a word and began to eat it. Walking along this street, he emphasized to himself that it was quite crowded and that there might be a place in this central area where he could have a strong drink. Suddenly, the blond young man's attention was drawn to the sounds coming from the right side of the buildings, and he stopped and turned his head to see what was going on. It turns out that there was a fight in which a group of guys attacked one guy, knocked him to the ground, and kicked him while saying something. The injured boy managed to wash himself and escape, crying bitterly at what they had done to him and calling for help. On his way, he met Heck and grabbed his hands and began to ask for help, explaining that he had been attacked and beaten by a crowd of guys. The second son of a respectable family, looking the young man straight in the eye, calmly said that he was being beaten because he was weak, so he saw no point in helping him. After taking a few steps, the gentleman told him not to try to get help from anyone and to overcome his difficulties himself. Only then would he become stronger. Having walked a few meters, the blond boy was looking around, enjoying his candy, and couldn't decide which establishment he wanted to go to and have a strong drink. Suddenly, he was approached by a drugged man standing against the wall with a large hood over his head, covering half of his face. Then the stranger said that he noticed that the young man was always looking around, so he decided to ask him what he was looking for. Maybe he could help. The second son of a noble family held his hands out and said that he was looking for an establishment with the best booze around. After hearing this wish, the man invited the boy to follow him because he knew where one of these places was, and it was very close. When they walked a few meters through a deserted small street, they came to an inconspicuous door, which the stranger offered to enter. Before going inside, the guy stopped and checked to make sure there was alcohol, and then suggested that it might be a pretty popular place. As soon as he was inside, he noticed a group of men in front of him who, seeing him, began to laugh loudly, saying that it was a kind of trap. However, this did not frighten the young man at all. He continued to taste the candy, saying that it was a pity there was no booze, because that was what he was looking for. One of the impudent men looked at the guest and emphasized that he seemed to be from a wealthy family, because his clothes were sparkling in the sun. The bald man began to slowly approach Heck, and at the same time told him that he could put everything he had in his pockets and go home. However, the guy decided to have a little fun and anger these self-confident men, so he said that he did not want to obey this order. Then he smiled sarcastically and said that until today he had been taking things from others, but no one had ever robbed him. The insolence listened carefully to these words and began to laugh out loud, because this young man does not look like the person he claims to be. The chief knelt down and said that he thought the gentleman had been raised as a houseplant, so he did not understand anything about real life. Therefore, the man then turned to his subordinate and asked him to crush a little bone for their guest to show the severity of life. Without hesitation, Kachak showed his fist and said that the young man hadn't noticed his muscles right away, and the man replied that his eyesight was fine. The boy was tired of all this, so he threw his candy aside and loudly announced that he was hen from a respectable family. However, the opponent did not hear the last words because he was thinking about how he would raise his hand up the hill and where he should strike first. But he didn't have time to fulfill his plan because he was outrun by a blonde guest who swung and hit the man on the right cheek with his palm. The blow was so strong that the victim fell to the ground and all his comrades froze from shock and surprise. However, not only the insolent man was in bad shape, but also Heng himself, because even after applying minimal force in the blow, his arm still broke in the wrist. The young man began to worry that he might embarrass himself among the street hooligans, so he tried to quickly put his arm back in place. Instead, they did not understand anything and decided to take turns attacking the opponent in order to eventually exhaust and defeat him. This time, the young man tried to act more cautiously and managed to deal with each attacker properly and win. During a short pause, he tried to check all the parts of his body and realized that this time, everything was fine and he was safe and sound. When no one else dared to attack him, the young man turned to the men and asked why they had lost their fighting spirit that they had before. With these words, he angered these street hooligans again, and they took out their weapons and decided to attack simultaneously this time to win. This time, however, they did not succeed as well as they would have liked, because the guest did not give them the opportunity to strike at least one blow, but he did it well. The leader of this gang was watching everything that was happening and was not only shocked, but also scared, because they had never had to face such an opponent before. The deputy chief pointed his finger at the young man and stammered aloud and asked him a question to understand what was going on. Heck looked down and asked what had surprised the deputy so much, and then explained that he did not yet know how to properly control his internal energy, so it all happened. For several minutes, the young man looked at the victims lying on the ground and waited for someone else to wake up and finish the job. And when he was about to leave, he saw a man on his right side who raised his head up a little and began to cough up blood loudly. He could not let this go, so he quickly approached the victim and put his right foot on his head so that his nose was directly on the ground. He was angry that the man had raised his head so quickly after he hit him, because he had imagined that he was considered a weakling. The leader of a group of street hooligans watched this picture with his mouth wide open and concluded that this was the devil in a human body. These reflections were interrupted by a guest who addressed the main man and said that he was the strongest among them, so he invited him to a duel. The man did not even think that he might not be able to overcome this self-confident guy, so he began to move quickly toward him. And having pushed off the ground firmly, he jumped high up but did not strike and landed on his knees in front of Heng and apologized for his behavior. The second son of a respectable family, smiling sarcastically, emphasized that the leader's priorities had changed rather quickly, but perhaps it was for the better. The man looked up and replied that he was just a good judge of the situation, because to survive in the darkest streets, you need to be a guesser. The blonde young man said that hooligans used to have some kind of honor, but it seems that this is a thing of the past, and that other laws of the streets are now in effect. The young man said that he had a strange feeling and for some reason did not believe the words of this bald man, and it was not surprising because he was already holding a sharp knife behind his back. In a matter of seconds, the main hooligan abruptly rose to his feet and swung his weapon directly at Hen, accompanied by a scream. However, he did not manage to hit his opponent because the young man managed to react in time and jumped high up and the knife hit the ground. After a short pause, the second son of a respectable family took a swing at the attacker, but he said with a fist and a serious tone that he would pay for everything. Seeing the seriousness of the boy's intentions, the man sat down a little and made a pitiful face because he had already realized that he could not escape from him. At that time, the senior heir was sitting in his study and examining his sword in detail to see if it was okay. His brother's assistant came to him and told him that, according to eyewitnesses, he was heading towards a neighborhood where there were always a lot of people. This information made the always calm brother a little angry, and he demonstrated this by loudly closing his sword and looking forward. Several hours had passed since the young man met with a group of street hooligans, and after a fight with them, they decided to buy him a drink. He was sitting on a small elevation so that he could see everyone at the same time, and the main bully served him with a drink. The bald man began to worry because he had poured out the entire contents of the last bottle, and the young man was still asking for more, which he did not have. From this information, the guy became furious and began to point his index finger at the maid and said that he had only wet his throat and that the drink was already over. The leader of the hooligans began to break out in small drops of sweat from excitement and quietly said that this was the 9th empty bottle. The young man didn't even want to hear it, and the man tried to explain to him that they had already spent all their money on luxury drinks and food. A second later, he added that he did not want to say that this was enough, but emphasized that everyone had the right to think that it could have satisfied the gentleman. After a pause, the bald man added that drinking too much is very harmful to health, and in his opinion, the young man has already gotten drunk enough to stop. The second son of a respectable family did not like this proposal at all, so he did not think twice about taking a swing and hitting the servant in the face. Turning his gaze to him, the guy said in a serious tone that he had no right to order him around because they were not on the same level. Then the young man turned his gaze to the audience sitting below and said menacingly that he would grind them all into powder and then make a drink out of it. He then added that these insolents can consider themselves lucky because in the good old days, he would have beheaded them and scattered them on the streets. After all this, Hen put the vessel he was drinking from on the floor and sat down on it, closing his eyes, saying that he needed to rest a bit. As soon as the blond young man fell asleep, the hooligans got to their feet and did not know what to do. Each had other suggestions, and one of them was to run away. So they decided to do just that, and heading for the exit, they suddenly heard the voice of a leader warning them not to do such things. After all, this could turn out to be a test, so the man said that he would first find out everything, and then he could carry out his plans. When the man crawled up to the young man, he put his ear to his face to hear him breathing, and concluded that he had indeed fallen asleep from drinking. Suddenly, the leader of the hooligans heard a strange tapping of fingers on his body, and the soldiers standing in front of him asked him how he dared to touch the son of a respectable family. Then slow but steady footsteps were heard in the room, and everyone in the room turned their heads to the exit to see who was there. The soldiers lined up so that this young man could pass without any obstacles to his brother, and the hooligans froze in their places with their mouths open. When they saw the dragon sword, they realized that the son of the Nam-gun family was visiting them, and they did not even know it. All the men turned white at the same time, and then began to be covered with drops of sweat from excitement because they realized that this could end badly for them. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the voice of the second son, who, through his dream, loudly addressed the heavenly inhabitants and asked why they had made him this way. The leader of the hooligans quickly covered his mouth because he did not want anyone else in the room to hear such nonsense, especially the eldest heir. Because he might think that they were deliberately drunk, he turned his gaze to the dragon sword and said in a calm tone that he would try to explain what had happened. The older heir, with a focused gaze and a menacing voice, ordered the bald man to remove his dirty hands from his brother's face. The leader of the hooligans immediately carried out the order because he understood exactly what could happen to him if he did not comply, and after that he began to smile nervously. As soon as the man was about to walk away from the sleeping young man, he got up and grabbed his wrist and said he needed another drink. After these words, the bald man realized that he could not escape the punishment of the dragon's sword, so he slowly turned his gaze to it. The reckoning was not long in coming. The eldest heir swung his right hand and struck the man very hard on the head. He flew back several meters and fell to the floor right in front of his comrades, who were seriously frightened. Looking at the victim with an angry look, the sword of the dragon added that he had asked to take his hands off his brother. Heng's assistant smelled the smell of alcohol on his breath and put her hands over her nose and asked him why he was so drunk when he couldn't stand it at all. As they were moving toward the exit, the second son of a respectable family noticed the eldest heir and asked the assistant who he was because he had never seen him before. The girl began to worry a lot because her master did not even recognize her older brother, and this could end badly for them all. Hen was very shocked to learn that he had an older brother at all, so his assistant exploded with emotion and shouted that he needed to sleep. So she and another soldier took the second son of a respectable family home to put him to rest, with his older brother watching. As soon as Hen and his assistant were no longer visible on the horizon, the dragon sword turned to the group of hooligans and said that he would show them how to insult young people. After walking a few meters, the young man looked at the house from which he was taken and said that the senior follower was now ordering the people inside. The assistant added that he would also punish them because they disturbed the younger gentleman's peace and did not allow him to rest properly. Then the lady added that the older one is usually calm and balanced, but not when it comes to his younger brother when he will do anything. The second son emphasized that he had also beaten them up before, and it must be painful for them to get the second round. The next morning, a long-haired, black-haired boy was practicing sword fighting on a platform with many wooden obstacles. He was so focused on the task that all these obstacles flew in different directions one by one, breaking into pieces. In just a few minutes of this intense fight, all the wooden opponents were defeated and destroyed, and the guy needed to catch his breath. While resting, the young man heard a voice behind him emphasizing that it was a great workout and that the guest was the young man's father. As the man came closer, he said that his son had finally reached the 10th circle of the Lonely Spirit sword technique and could now be called a tiger sword. The gentleman went on to say that they now consider Namgun to be the best heir to the family, but they just don't know yet that his son is as good as theirs. The young man bowed low and promised to live up to his father's expectations and prove that he was worthy of the best. After that, the father said that his son needed to go and get some rest because he had trained very well today and had left a lot of energy in the battle. Looking at his son's footprint, the man assumed that he would be able to defeat the dragon's sword earlier than he expected, and it turns out that the tiger would swallow the dragon. And if this really happens, he personally will have to defeat the sky that is above the dragon. During these words, the gentleman crushed a piece of wood in his hands. At this time, the second son of a respectable family was sitting in his room eating breakfast brought to him by his assistant, and he had a very good appetite. After drinking the honey drink, the young man looked at his interlocutor and asked her what was wrong with her expression, because she looked angry. After a short pause, the guy didn't get any response, so he smiled sweetly and said that the lady could tell him whatever she was thinking at that moment. The assistant did not have to ask for a long time. She opened her mouth wide and loudly asked why the young man was behaving so strangely. Without giving him a chance to answer, she continued that his bones had not yet fused properly, and he was already running away and starting a battle, even though he should be taking care of his body. The girl was simply unstoppable and said that he did not think at all about how many people's hearts were hurting because of his thoughtless behavior. Suddenly, the guy managed to say something, and it was that he also doesn't see that beautiful potion today, and it seems to him that there is not enough of it lately. The lady did not have time to calm down, so she raised her right hand to his face and asked if he really thought he was as easy to get as the neighbor's dog. The second son of a respectable family replied that he thought it was quite expensive, and the interlocutor said that he needed to give a few pieces of gold. The young man began rubbing his chin with his hand, saying that the price had gone up significantly, but he did not understand how his family, which was so wealthy, could not afford it. In the afternoon, a father whose son wants to defeat the dragon sword met with a secretive man in the backyard of his estate. He brought a message from the Cholhan fortress, and it didn't say anything special, just that they were asking what the situation was and if they needed help. The man was a little angry that after 10 years of waiting, these people had not learned to fully trust him. So he said that he would do everything himself and could tell the messengers not to interfere and thus not to interfere with his work. Finally, the messenger added that the head of a respected family had recently bought a valuable potion, and it took a lot of gold, which is already starting to run out. The man said that this could really happen because they have been trying to fill the leaky dishes for more than 10 years, and they still remain weak. Nam Gunhyun's body is very fragile, and from the moment he was born, he has 9 yin energy flows, and because of this, he is incapable of doing anything in this life. And in order to save the second son, the family spends all their reserves, but the treatment does not show any positive result. Suddenly, the messenger said that the young gentleman had been behaving rather strangely lately, and that it was making everyone in the fortress very nervous and worried. And all because he continues to train, and now he dares to go out into the city and get drunk until he passes out. The man said that we could ignore some trash like Hen, and ordered us to continue to monitor the surroundings of the main respectable family. At that time, the gentleman thought that the young man had just decided to have a little fun before his death, which could come at any moment. The second son started every morning with pull-ups on the bench for several sets to build muscle mass. And fortunately, today neither my shoulder nor wrists have been dislocated, and it turns out that due to these constant trainings, my body is gradually getting used to the loads. Suddenly, the young man thought that to break through the remaining energy flows, he would need an expensive and effective potion that his family might not be able to afford. Walking to the other room, Hen rubbed one of his shoulders and said to himself that he just wanted to sit on his ass and eat the potion and admire the effect. And he feels that the situation of Namgun's family is not the same as before, so he decided to put on the sweatshirt to find information. When he went out, he began to think about who he could get the information he needed, because he couldn't go around asking everyone because it would arouse suspicion. Suddenly, a brilliant idea came to the young man's mind, and it was to turn to black marketeers who would definitely not turn him in. After all, they are the ones who collect the darkest information and are constantly safe because they receive generous rewards from wealthy people. In short, these people are ready to sell any secret information, even the emperor's secret intrigues, so they will definitely get the information he needs. At this time, in another place where the future rival of the dragon sword lived, evening gatherings with books under a lighted candle took place. A friend came to the black-haired guy and told him that he had heard rumors that a cockroach from a respectable family had gotten drunk, so he was carried home by guards. At first, the boy didn't understand who his friend was talking about, so he decided to tell him directly that this cockroach from Namgun's family was Hyun. The guest went on to say that this young man began to go to the library often and also started to work out, even though he couldn't even pick up a broom properly before. After a pause, the friend added that if they drank this potion, they could have become world-class masters, and that the fact that he was slightly cured did not bode well. The black-haired guy was really angry about these facts, but he still tried to be calm and assured himself that this Hen was still far from them. The interlocutor abruptly rose to his feet and loudly said that he was very interested in all this and wanted to see with his own eyes what condition this gentleman was in. When he turned to face the exit and began to walk, his friend turned to him and asked him to just look and not to do anything. A few hours later, the man found himself next to Hen, whom he had pushed as he passed by, and he fell to the ground and turned to his attacker. As soon as he heard the slightest appeal to him, he immediately stopped, turned his head back, and asked if he was calling him. The second son came up holding his shoulder and emphasized that if someone is pushed, they should usually apologize and not just walk by. The stranger did not show such a desire, so Hen said that he could not pass by an uneducated person, and again asked him to apologize for his actions. The interlocutor came very close and looked directly into the young man's eyes and said that it looked like he was seriously determined to die. The blond man did not like this statement in his direction, so he raised his eyebrows and replied in a serious tone that if he kept pushing, he would pee blood. The offender did not believe it, so he said that everything he said was bullshit, and at the same time began to swing his right hand, which was clenched into a fist, to strike. However, everything did not happen as he had imagined. Not only did the man fail to strike, but he was hit in the face instead, so that it turned in the other direction. But it didn't end with one punch. Hen continued to beat his opponent with all his might, and the latter tried to say that he was in over his head and regretted it. After another blow, after which the impudent man fell to the ground, he put his hands in front of him, closed his eyes, and shouted that he had had enough. Rubbing his hands together, the second son said that ill-mannered jerks should be paid handsomely for their services in order to learn proper manners. Turning in the direction he needed to go, Hen stopped for a second and added that he wished the stranger to be more careful in the future. However, the victim was enraged by this humiliation and decided that he would not let it go and took out a knife and chased the offender. But he somehow felt that there was some kind of threat behind him, so he suddenly stopped and kicked the attacker right in the stomach. He began to scream loudly in pain and dropped his weapon from his hand, and in a matter of seconds, he landed backwards right into a concrete wall. As he approached, the young man realized by his clothes that he was a guard, but it was strange that he was attacking from behind, so he asked if he was from their family. At that moment, he remembered that he had experienced similar situations in the past, so it doesn't matter which family traitors come from. Sitting down next to the victim's body, he addressed him and emphasized that one should only get into a fight when he is confident in his opponent. Looking closely at the stranger's battered face, the young man was still wondering who he was and why he would attack him in the middle of the day. At this time, on the most crowded street of the town, a little boy was buying a bun from one of the friendly vendors. However, he never got to eat it because as soon as he was about to take the first bite, someone stole the food from under his nose. And this thief turned out to be Hen, who was passing by and thinking about where he needed to go to find the black marketeer he needed so badly. They used to hide in the corners, but now they still need to be found. Suddenly, on one of the walls, the boy noticed a sign symbolizing their residence in the house. Upon entering the room, the second son of a respectable family saw a bulky man who was sad about the low income this month. These reflections and sadness were interrupted by a voice behind him, who asked if the man was a black traitor. Looking around the room, the guy emphasized that he needed to brighten up his workplace because it was no different from the rest. The owner of the premises angrily asked who the young man was and how he had found out about the place or who had told him about it. But he didn't react to these words at all. Instead, he walked over to one of the walls and pressed an inconspicuous tile to find what he was looking for. It was the door to a secret room where rare goods are stored, and the owner of the premises was shocked by such impudence, to put it mildly. Hen, smiling happily, pointed to the open door and suggested that since they had met, perhaps they should come in on Wednesday and discuss everything. The man was seriously angry with the impudent guest, so he started holding onto his weapon with one hand and said out loud that no one could enter the house. So he jumped up from under his counter and pointed directly at the young man, saying that he looked like a carcass lying there with no signs of life. The young man reacted quickly and threw the first punch, which caused his wrist to dislocate again, and he realized that when you do good, you make a lot of noise. Only after that did the black market trader decide to obey the guest's will and listen to what he wanted from him. When they entered the secret room, the second son of a respectable family looked around and was shocked to see so many goods. The victim's face was already swollen due to the beatings, and he could barely ask questions to find out what brought the young man to this place. Heng sat down on a chair opposite the interlocutor and assured him that he could calm down, because he only needed information. The merchant asked what exactly the guest was interested in, and he replied that he wanted to know the history of the last 70 years, including the victory over the demonic horde. After spending several hours in the secret room, the young man went outside and was clearly not satisfied with what he heard from his interlocutor. After all, he had already said from the very beginning that the winner in the battle with the demons was the martial arts god Cheon Yigimdae Hiop, not Dokbae Ha Huyun. Although he didn't like the first sentence, he decided not to correct it and instead asked to know more about the victory itself. And he began to tell me that the winner had bet his fate on defeating demons and engaging in the most terrible battle in history. For more than a month, the two armies fought, and in the end, the alliance was able to win. And of course, the demons were defeated in the memories of the young man, who recalled that this battle lasted 7 days. Then the guy asked what the name of the demon king was, and the interlocutor replied that he was nicknamed Seung Ma, but in fact, his name was Ha-Hu-En. Stopping a few meters from the building he had just left, Hen wondered how it was possible to falsify all the facts so horribly. Walking slowly home through the narrow streets of the city, the young man was still thinking about all the information he had received because it did not match his knowledge. He couldn't understand why they changed the story, and thinking about it gave him a very bad headache and made him scream all over the street. The second son stopped in his tracks, closed his eyes, gritted his teeth, and rubbed his face, saying to himself that he needed to start with something more urgent. So he thought that he had heard that the Nam-gun family had long been in last place among the 5 great families, and that they were inferior to everyone else in terms of wealth. The young man could not understand how this happened, because during the time of the Sword King, the family was at the very top, and he added that it did not last long. After the death of the king, the family began to go downhill, and recently, because of the second son, who was ill, they sold everything they could. Hen recalled how he was happy that he was born with a silver spoon in his mouth, but it all turned out to be a lie and was slipped to him by the heavenly hosts. When the young man entered his mansion, the assistant immediately turned to him and asked why he had been walking for so long, and he said that he had no time for that now. However, the girl finally told her gentleman in a serious tone that the head of the family was calling him, and he should go to him immediately. Everyone had long been waiting for the appearance of the second son, who had been wandering the streets doing something stupid all this time. As soon as the young man got closer, he saw that he was already being met by the head of the family, his father, and his older brother standing next to him. After that, he turned his gaze to the right and could not understand who the man was standing next to them with a distorted expression. The head of the respectable family turned to his second son and said in a serious tone that he had called him to ask him something. So far, the guy did not understand what was going on here, so he decided to clarify and asked what exactly they wanted to ask him. Instead, a guest with a contorted face abruptly stepped forward and asked if it was Hyun who had beaten So-ah to such a serious condition. The young man froze in his tracks at this question because he was not familiar with the name and tried to figure out who it was. These reflections were interrupted by an angry guest who loudly shouted why the young man was silent and did not answer the question he had asked. The father decided to calm the guest down a bit and asked to let him listen to Hen, who was about to explain something to them. And only now the young man realized that he had beaten the man's son the other day, and since his father calls this man his brother, it turns out that they are related. At this suggestion, the young man began to smile, but this behavior did not satisfy his uncle, so he offered to look at his son. To do this, he moved his right hand a little to the side, where he could see a young man with one arm and head bandaged. The second son of a respectable family was not at all surprised by the victim's appearance. He was even happy that he was alive at all. The father of the beaten son decided to ask him again who did this to him right now so that everyone present could hear the answer. The victim slowly lowered his head and then his eyes down and said that he had been beaten by Hen right on the street. After these words, the father began to address all those present, asking if they had heard what their son had said and asked what they were going to do. The first thing the head of the respected family did was to approach his second son and look him straight in the eye and ask if he really did it. The young man quickly and clearly replied that it was not him, and the victim simply exploded with anger because he had managed to lie to so many people. Then the boy raised both hands to his face and swore to his father with a sweet expression that he had not touched his relative with a finger. The man, of course, believed his child, so he turned to his brother and asked if So-ah could have hurt himself during one of the training sessions. The gentleman with the distorted expression did not like the fact that the boss was now trying to assure everyone that his son was a liar. After these words, the chief pointed to his son and added that he could not have beaten an experienced warrior so badly because his body was too fragile for that. The interlocutor calmly said that he had heard rumors that the young man had recovered and even started training. His father said that it hadn't even been a month since he woke up from his illness, and his mind hadn't recovered yet, so he couldn't be stronger than So-a. The victim's father looked at him and asked him if he was lying to him, but he shook his head. And then another black-haired guest interrupted the conversation and said that he believed the words of the beaten man. Although he can be too harsh, he was not caught lying. The eldest heir of a respected family also decided to speak, taking a few steps forward and emphasizing that he also believed in his brother. For several seconds, the men stood opposite each other and looked directly into each other's eyes, holding their weapons with their right hands. Hen began to rub his chin with satisfaction because he thought the situation was unfolding very interestingly and now wondered who could win the battle. However, it was not to be, as the man with a distorted expression opened his mouth wide and ordered the two to calm down. And when everyone looked at him, he added that they were about to fight in front of the head of the family. The black-haired young man exhaled loudly and approached the leader, apologizing for the momentary blurring of his consciousness by anger. The older gentleman smiled sincerely in response and said that everything was fine because he could understand how the blood was boiling in a young body. The young man folded his arms as if in prayer, looked down and bowed to thank for his understanding. Then the older heir approached the other man and addressed him as his uncle and also apologized for making a fuss. Hen didn't like this course of events because he wanted to watch the fight, not everyone apologizing to each other. Suddenly, his uncle turned his angry gaze on him, as if he had heard what his nephew was thinking, and this alarmed the young man a little. After a short pause, the man came closer to the boy, and pointing his finger at his right side, accusingly asked if he hadn't made the noise. Then the gentleman leaned close to the young man's face and warned him once again that he was asking him for the last time whether he had caused his son's injury. This time, the second son of a respectable family decided not to show any pretense, but to tell the whole truth so that everyone would know who he really is. After these words and the expression on the other man's face, the uncle realized that there must be something interesting here, so he told him to tell everything immediately. And as soon as the young man was about to say the first word, not a sound, but a large stream of blood came out of his mouth, which frightened everyone present. The guy fell to his knees and, holding his throat, continued to cough up blood loudly, while all his relatives quickly rushed to help him. Helping him to stand up, the assistant said that they were hoping that he was finally okay, but it started again. Suddenly, the young man slowly began to raise his hand to the sky and asked the girl if she also saw the energy rainbow caused by his blood. The head of the family ordered to quickly take Heng to his bedroom and then added that he would contact the liquor store himself and call him. The assistant took her master's hand and began to slowly lead him into the room, while all those present remained in their seats and watched them go. All along the way, Hen told his companion that he didn't know what to do because he could still see that rainbow in the sky. A few minutes later, the family leader turned to his brother, who accused his son of beating his blood brother. Then the man exploded with emotion and pointed at his son and shouted how such a weak and sick boy could do this to So-A. The gentleman turned his gaze to the beaten man with a distorted expression and emphasized that So-A was not in the best shape right now either, so they should talk later. After an awkward pause, the injured young man quietly said that he was fine, but his expression still remained sad. The father sharply turned to his son and reminded him that it must be very painful for him, and the young man abruptly changed his mind to what his father had told him. Then the guests decided that there was no point in staying here any longer, so they began to walk slowly to the exit to go home. In a serious tone, the father asked his son to wait a little longer because the moment would come when they would be able to take revenge for everything. By this time, Hen and his assistant had already reached his room, and the girl was surprised to see that the gentleman did not look as sick as he had a few minutes earlier. As soon as they were alone, the guy pushed his companion away and said that she could get the hell out of his way. Sitting on the floor, the young lady looked at her gentleman in surprise and then asked him questions to find out if he was feeling well. Coughing, the young man turned his gaze to the interlocutor and replied in a calm tone that he was fine, just pretending a little. The lady started yelling at the guy because he scared everyone so much, and he started explaining that he was too lazy to make excuses. The assistant emphasized that her husband's character was becoming more and more strange every day, and these problems began to appear on the day he became very ill. The second son was angry that she was beginning to guess, so he quickly ordered her to find a suitable sword to practice with. When she heard his request, she froze in her tracks because he had never used a weapon before because his health did not allow it. A few hours later, the head of the family had lunch with the eldest heir and asked him about Hen's condition, to which he replied that everything seemed to be fine. Then the young man took one sip of tea and told his father that Chom-san had told him that the whole bad condition was just a fiction and a deception. At these words, the father froze in place with his mouth open and then realized that the fact that his younger son had beaten So-A was indeed true. So the men began to wonder if this was even possible, despite the fact that Hen had been ill for many years and had not even practiced martial arts. In conclusion, the senior heir said that he really wished it were true because it would relieve them of many problems. After the afternoon rest, the second son of a respectable family went deep into the forest, so that no one would see what he was going to do. Then the young man began to bandage his wrists, because he thought that this way it would not get hurt during classes. When he finished bandaging, the young man took a sword in his right hand and tried to swing it once to check if everything was okay. The sword seemed quite heavy, so the guy realized that if it were not for the bandages, he would not have been able to hold it for so long. Recalling the image of his older brother and uncle's son, Hen realized that in his current situation, it would be difficult for him to fight them. This means that even though he managed to defeat the street thug, he needs to train constantly to keep fit. And no matter what the story says, first he needs to extinguish the heat that is getting to his heels. So the young man began to swing his sword in different directions, and thus relearned how to use it in his new body. During this training, the leaves from the trees flew in different directions because the branches were the rivals for the second sun. He realized that he needed to train constantly in order to at least reach 30% of his strength from his previous life. After a few hours of concentrated training, the guy began to do more and more tricks. And because of this, the energy of the Dark King, Chang Chong, doubled, so there is a benefit to training for life and death. Suddenly, the young man hit the trunks of 3 trees that grew near each other, and their tops fell to the ground in a second. But this did not satisfy the young man, so he realized that he would have to train for a long time to get the desired result. And since he is a son of the Nam Gong family, he cannot use the Tao. He must use the technique of wielding the sword of this family and adapt it to his body. He also decided that one day, he would have to try the technique of flashing lightning and 30 thunder sounds. After applying this technique, the young man realized that he needed to make it faster and more concise, to concentrate his strength and direct it to the final blow. And to make it work, you need to remove unnecessary actions. And immediately after all these conclusions, the guy did something. After this technique, a large cloud of dust rose on the lawn where the young man was practicing, settling very slowly, making it impossible to breathe normally. Then the second son realized that he had changed something in this technique, and it could no longer bear the previous name, so he decided to call it the 3-roll sword technique. Returning home, the young man wondered how to organize his next training sessions to get results quickly. In the late afternoon, a lady entered one of the small rooms in the town and addressed her father, who was busy at the time. All day today, the man was engaged in the correct distribution of finances, which they did not really have enough for anything. The young lady was upset that things were so bad, but he hurried to reassure her and said that he would somehow deal with the finances of the respectable family. When they sat down to drink tea, the father said that he had invited his daughter here because of the younger gentleman, who was rumored to have changed a lot. The girl calmly replied that compared to a month and a half ago, he had become a completely different person in body and mind. The man listened carefully to the woman's answer and asked a clarifying question about whether the boy had really become healthy and felt better. The lady said that he really started to feel better in terms of health, but sometimes he feels bad after his workouts. Then the father asked whether the other son was still taking the potion, and the girl, smiling broadly and happily, replied that he was not just taking it and just absorbing it. And then the young lady's expression changed dramatically, and she began to suspect the interlocutor that he might have called her because of this potion. The daughter assumed that her husband wanted her to reduce the amount of this herb because it was very expensive for a respectable family. The young lady guessed correctly, but her father did not say it directly, but simply hinted at it, and she said that she would try to do everything in her power. The man tried to explain that a respectable family needs a lot of money to live well, and they cannot spend it on the right and on the left. When the lady was leaving, she bowed low to her father, thanked him for the hospitality, and a second later added that she would remember his request. As she approached the door, she heard the interlocutor finally address her and ask if she was having a hard time working, and she replied that she could handle it. Late in the evening, Hen bandaged his hands because to master the new technique perfectly, he needs to practice even more, but his body is letting him down a bit. As soon as he was done with the bandaging, he turned to face the door and turned to Chom San and asked her if she had brought any potions. When he received no answer, he went out into the corridor and could not understand where his assistant, who was constantly hanging around him, had gone. Having failed to find the girl, the young man threw his sword over his shoulder and decided to eat a healing potion after he had practiced. Suddenly, the young man recalled a conversation with a black market vendor who told him that his family was having some financial difficulties because of his second son. Looking around, he saw no one and began to think about not going far to train and doing it today right here in the yard. After swinging his new sword once, the young man felt quite strange sensations that he had not felt in his body during the first training. Suddenly, the sword hit the ground with its sharp tip, and despite his best efforts, the boy could not pick it up, and this upset him. After a few minutes of effort, the second son of a respectable family decided that he should rest today until Chom-san brought the potion. That evening, a man sneaked into the estate with the intention of monitoring what was happening at night and who was doing what. But he couldn't stay unnoticed, because Hen noticed him anyway and began to speculate that a scout had snuck in. The young man was a bit alarmed because he wondered who would be watching him in the estate of a respected family and assumed that it could be his father. And this was the only correct assumption in the young man's mind because the man was too worried about his second son to put such a person in charge of him. When the gentleman in black returned to his uncle, he told him that his nephew had been training late in the evening, but that he should not worry about it. And he explained that he certainly looks healthy at first glance, but this is not enough for him to be able to fight with someone on equal terms. After receiving this information, the father began to think about whether his son had lied to him when he said that Hen had beaten him so badly. The gentleman in black asked if he should continue to follow Gun Hyuk, and my uncle said that he could stop because they had already learned everything they needed to know. Suddenly, the man got to his feet and told his assistant that it was time to prepare for a big job. During a regular training session in the forest, Hen used his new technique so well that a powerful explosion occurred, destroying everything around him. Although it was a successful attempt, it did not go unnoticed by the young man, and his nose began to bleed from the amount of effort he had expended. The young man was upset because of this, so he sat down on a log and thought about what to do next, because he had such a long way to go, and his body was constantly resisting. He is also so sad to train among these trees that don't even offer any resistance, and therefore he cannot feel the full taste of battle. Walking slowly home, the guy convinced himself that one day there would be a holiday on his street and he would be able to use his body properly. As soon as Hen entered the mansion, he was approached by an assistant who was approaching her master with quick steps. The boy immediately asked her to bring him a large amount of the potion, but the lady said that now was not the time because something terrible had happened. The young man folded both arms across his chest and angrily emphasized that his assistant always had bad news, but still asked what happened this time. The girl pointed to the door of one of the nearest buildings and said that a meeting had just started where the head of the department could be taken away from his post. The young man was not upset by the information, but instead put his hands to his sides and said that it did not matter to him who would be the leader of this family. And he explained that it happens, that a person goes downhill throughout his life, and all because you get very tired of sitting in one place all the time. The assistant, clenching her fists in anger, said that it was impossible to talk about it as a matter of strangers because the head of the family was his father. And then she emphasized that he got into this situation because of his second son, because he bought the most expensive potion for him and spent all the money. Only now did the young man realize that if his father was removed from his position, he would not be able to continue to buy him the potions he needed for proper training. The guy quickly turned in the opposite direction and shouted to his interlocutor that he needed to stop the meeting immediately. All the elders sat at a large rectangular table and accused the leader of wasting a lot of money on his son's treatment. The father didn't care what they said about him. He looked in front of him and told everyone that he would cure his child, no matter what it cost him. The gentleman sitting on the right side turned to the leader and emphasized that this was not the time to speak like that, and that he should give up on Hen. The man did not even want to hear such a request, so after a short pause, he looked forward and said in a serious tone that he wanted to leave his post. He explained that if he could not protect even one of his sons, how could he take responsibility for all members of their family? All the participants in the meeting suddenly rose to their feet at the same time and indignantly began to shout whether the gentleman was serious about his decision. The leader said that if it would help him save his son, he would give up this position without pity, but they should continue to treat him. Suddenly, amidst all this noise, my brother's voice was heard saying that the boss was a big coward who wanted to avoid responsibility. After all, what a man wants to do is just to run away, but this escape still does not relieve him of responsibility for the embezzlement. Therefore, the gentleman with the distorted expression suggested analyzing all the actions of the leader over the past 10 years, even if it meant lifting everything around him. Other members of the meeting were not so sure that this was really necessary because they did not know how to question all the years of the government. The man was angry that no one immediately wanted to support his idea because he did not believe that the leader had spent all the money on his son's treatment. The gray-haired gentleman clarified that he really wanted to say that the money was spent not only on treatment, but also on other things, and perhaps he could prove it. And the man, with his arms outstretched, began to tell me that the guy with a body like crystal suddenly started practicing martial arts and getting drunk. This shows that the young man is completely healthy, and the leader still continues to spend large sums of money on his treatment from his family's savings. The gentleman then asked the leader if he was really spending money on his son's treatment, or if the money was going elsewhere. As soon as the head of the family was about to repeat that he wanted to resign voluntarily, his younger son entered the meeting room. This audacity made my father angry, and he turned to Heng and told him how dare he come in here, and warned him that he should not interfere in this case at all. My uncle said in a calm tone that if the young man came to their meeting, they could listen to his point of view on the situation. The young man looked at the man with an angry look and said that now he would pay the price because he was so grateful for their decision. With a twisted expression on his face, the gentleman asked directly whether the boy's 9 yin flows had been cured and how he was feeling. The young man replied that they were not completely cured, but his health had improved, and if he continued to take the potion, he would become even healthier. And after he told me that he had also started practicing martial arts, everyone in the room started discussing it with each other. The uncle emphasized that the money spent on his potion could have built a house for the family and suggested that they stop taking it. Hen put both his hands to his sides and said with a sneering smile that he did not want to stop taking this medicine, and this answer made the other man very angry. Then the young man began to explain that he sees the point in continuing to take this potion even if they see nothing useful in it. The gentleman began to reproach him for being too self-confident for a person who had just started studying martial arts, and the young man offered to fight. The man was shocked, to put it mildly, that the young man offered him such a thing in the presence of all the elders, and was not at all afraid to do so. The young man held his hands out to the side and explained that this battle would help him show that all the potions he drank were not wasted, bought with family money. The gentleman with a distorted expression stretched his right hand forward and asked who he wanted to fight, and then there was a short pause in the room. After that, Hen replied quite clearly that he wanted to fight the son of this arrogant gentleman, and that he had already seen him, and he seemed very strong. My uncle began to laugh out loud at this decision, and the thought flashed through my mind that this was the best opportunity to deal with this fry. The young man asked why his interlocutor was laughing so much. Was he scared? But the man replied that he was surprisingly happy that it was going to be his son. The head of the family asked him to stop because he could not listen to these words, and reminded him that he had previously promised to take full responsibility for what he had done. A gentleman with a distorted expression said that in this place you can't throw words around because it's a place for gatherings where every word is important. My father realized that no one would listen to him here because the other elders were already discussing the upcoming duel. When everyone came to the final decision that the battle would take place, the leader put his head down because he realized that his son's opponent was too strong. But the father of another participant in the battle was very happy about what was happening and spread his arms to the side and told everyone that tomorrow the battle would take place. Finally, Hyun added that in return for his victory, he asked that the family not interfere in the affairs of the main family and not interfere with his tasks. His uncle smiled slightly and agreed, and then said that if he lost, they would both be responsible, he and his dad. As soon as the head of the family went outside with his son, he raised his head up in pity and asked God why such trials were necessary. After that, he turned to face Heng, who was standing behind him, and pointed his index finger at him and asked if he knew what he had done. The guy didn't see anything wrong with that, so he said, smiling broadly, that he had found a great way to fix everything with a fight. The father could not understand where such confidence came from in his son, and his body did seem to improve, but his mind had left his head. Suddenly, the family leader's thoughts were interrupted by a boy holding his stomach and saying that he was very hungry, so they had to go home immediately. While the second son was stuffing his mouth with food, an assistant sat across from him with a strange expression on her face and asked him why he had created such a situation. At first, the young man was not in the mood to explain anything, but after a few minutes, he got bored with eating like that, so he clarified what the lady was talking about. The girl furiously emphasized that his body had hardly healed and he had decided to put it in the clutches of death on his own. After taking a sip of tea, the young man said sadly that he was listening to his interlocutor and his mood was fading because she did not believe in him. The assistant folded her arms across her chest and explained that it was natural to be worried, and then added that the young man should think about how to survive the battle. Then a big argument arose between them because the second son demanded more of the potion and his interlocutor refused to give it to him. That same evening, the family leader called the eldest heir to him and asked him an important request regarding his brother's upcoming battle. After listening to his father's entire monologue, the son summarized in a serious tone that if he felt that Hen's life was in danger, he would intervene. That same evening, the uncle also met with his black-haired son, who would have to fight the leader's heir tomorrow. The young man assured the gentleman that he would move like a tiger who is completely focused, even if he had to catch a simple rabbit. The next day, when everyone gathered at the site where the battle was to take place, everyone discussed what was going to happen today before they started. And when the two rivals met, the black-haired young man turned to Heng and said that he would let him attack first, and he could put all his strength into the blow. Putting his hand to his head, the second son of a respectable family smiled sweetly and said that he was grateful for the opportunity and would definitely take advantage of it. At this time, the thought flashed through his mind that his real rival was Namgun Ryong, and after that, he hoped that they would fight. The family leader opened his mouth wide and shouted loudly about the start of the fight, so that everyone present was silent and finally focused on the battle. In a matter of seconds, something happened that no one had expected, so everyone jumped to their feet at the same time with wide eyes. As it turned out, Heng did indeed take the opportunity to strike first, and with this very blow, he simply knocked out his opponent. It happened so fast that none of the spectators present even had time to notice when the collision occurred. Everyone had already seen the end result. But everyone began to discuss this blow again, and the fact that the second son of a respectable family had been practicing martial arts for only a month and already had such a result. At this time, the family leader sat in his seat with both arms folded across his chest and listened to the speculation of people sitting nearby. Hen had a small problem with his hand, as it was dislocated in the wrist during the impact, and he could not put it back for several minutes. By this time, the opponent had already gotten to his feet and called the young man a coward for throwing a punch before the start of the fight. The young man, picking at his little finger in his ear, replied that this was complete nonsense, because as soon as the sword is in your hands and you enter the battlefield, it is considered the beginning. Suddenly, the father of the black-haired young man jumped to his feet and, with his arms outstretched, began to address the people, saying that Hen had attacked earlier. The elders discussed this case with each other and could not come to a final decision because they believed that both ways would be right. The uncle gritted his teeth in anger because those he had counted on so much had quickly changed their minds and were now speaking out against him. Therefore, all that was left for the man to do was to address his son and encourage him with his words to fight with dignity in this fight. His father was upset by this reaction, but he first apologized to him and then said that he would be more attentive to his rival in the future. The guards of the estate, who also came to watch the legendary battle, began to say that only now would everything really begin. To support the black-haired young man, his beaten brother turned to him and asked him to show his full potential and not to be ashamed of anything. And then the young man decided that from that moment on he would do his best to demonstrate to everyone who was the best warrior in the family. When he reached for his sword, white lightning began to spread around him, and his eyes were focused on his opponent. However, he was unable to get his weapon because Hen came close to him and touched his arm with his right hand, preventing him from doing so. In this position, they froze for several minutes, and everyone present began to speculate about what happened that the black-haired man was unable to attack. Then they bounced off each other sharply, and a small cloud of dust rose on the battlefield, hiding them a bit. The second son of a respectable family did not intend to give up so quickly, so he approached his opponent and this time kicked him right in the chest. This blow was so strong that the opponent was knocked several meters away like a fluffy feather, landing on the ground with his legs up. The beaten brother was upset that it was happening, and the rest of the audience was shocked that Hen had managed to successfully deal with his opponent again. The uncle froze in place with his mouth wide open in surprise, because he clearly did not expect his son to be so easily defeated. Hen's father, on the other hand, lightly clenched his hand into a fist with joy, but tried to do it without anyone noticing, because it was too early to think about victory. The second son was not doing well, as his wrists still did not work properly and he had to make his last kick with his elbow. When the victim was slowly getting to his feet, he looked his opponent straight in the eye and called him a treacherous person. Then he began to threaten that as soon as he managed to get the sword, in a minute, there would be nothing left of Hen and all his efforts would be in vain. Instead, the blond young man smiled broadly and said that he was giving his opponent the opportunity to show his signature one punch of the lonely spirit. These words made the black-haired boy very angry, so he quickly jumped to his feet and sharply pulled out his sword and began to swing it. However, Hen was able to dodge this blow by simply throwing his head back, and to tease his opponent, he asked if that was all he could do with his sword. The family leader began to worry about his son because a single stroke of a lonely spirit is dangerous because it leaves a lasting impact. The black-haired young man did not give up and moved quickly around his opponent to finally wear him down and deliver the first blow that would show who he really was. For the first few minutes, the blond young man managed to avoid a collision, and the black-haired man asked how long he could dodge. Hen, dodging another punch, told his interlocutor that he was currently the slowest young man he had ever fought. Of course, these words could not help but catch the opponent, so he just hung in the air for a few seconds, but then continued to attack faster. The second son of a respectable family had the opportunity to strike, but he was worried about hurting his wrist again, as it was very painful. But the desire to demonstrate his capabilities to everyone present won out, so he began to slap his opponent in the face with quick movements of his hands. My brother, who had already been beaten by this guy before, grabbed his head in excitement because he had beaten him earlier in the street with the same technique. The beaten, black-haired young man fell to the ground and began to cough loudly because the blood on his face blocked the path for normal breathing. However, Hen did not intend to let him rest for even a minute, so he went up to him, put his right hand on his head, and asked why he was sitting down. Without waiting for any response, the young man struck again, throwing his opponent back a few meters and dragging him to the ground. Being so engrossed in this battle, the guy did not notice that this time he hit his hand, which began to hurt him a lot and in a few seconds increased in size. Naturally, this made the second son of the family leader very angry and decided to accuse his rival, who was already throwing his hands up in the air at the sight of him. Then Hen began to slowly take out his sword and smiled broadly because he had forgotten that he had it and now he would use it in battle. While looking at the weapon, the young man said to himself that he could have used it earlier and therefore would not have had to fight with his bare hands and hurt himself. When the black-haired young man saw his opponent's intentions, he pitifully raised his hands in the air to show that he was not ready to fight with swords. One of the elders became too worried about the further course of the battle, so he nervously asked the judges if they should stop the two. However, what happened next surprised everyone a bit, but also alarmed them, because Hen threw his sword away and it got stuck in the ground next to him. The opponent continued to sit on the ground with his mouth wide open, wondering if the second son of the family was going to use the scabbard. Because of these guesses, the victim began to be covered with drops of sweat from excitement, and the opponent showed the sword sheath and said that it was a severe flogging. And of course, in a matter of seconds, the guy approached his brother and began to beat him with this metal case on all parts of his body. All the spectators covered their mouths with their hands in shock, because no one expected that today's battle would unfold in this way. Everyone thought otherwise. Suddenly, Hen stopped and held his right hand, saying that it even hurt his arm a little bit, so he was done with this weapon. The black-haired young man's face was already very swollen from the blows, but he had no strength to resist it. After a short pause, the blond young man came to the conclusion that he could use his other arm and could use the case for a while longer. The uncle could not stand to watch his son being destroyed, so he put one hand forward and asked them to stop the battle before it was too late. The black-haired young man tried to ask his abuser to stop doing what he was doing because he had no more strength to endure it. However, he didn't even want to hear it, so he struck him in the face again and was going to do it again and again. But the uncle could not stand it and decided to take matters into his own hands, so he opened his mouth wide and shouted loudly for Hen to stop and stop beating his son. After these words, the young man did not hit his opponent, but managed to stop a few centimeters from his head, and it turns out that the father saved his child. It was painful and unbearable for the man to hear that his son had lost, because this was not the course of events he had expected when he started all this. Hen turned his gaze to his uncle and emphasized that he should not take his words back later, because next time he would not stop. At that moment, the black-haired guy became dizzy and collapsed to the ground in front of everyone, and his family was very scared for his condition. When the father came closer to the child, tears appeared in his eyes because he saw how his son was beaten and the wounds on his face. The blond young man said to take the victim home immediately and start treatment right away, and a second later added that the first days would be the hardest. At the end of the day, the three guards of the estate gathered together to discuss today's battle, as it has already become legendary. One of them held his hands out to the side and said that they say that if you can defeat the disease of energy flows, you will become a better warrior. The boys laughed out loud and then began to suggest that their hen might actually become the best warrior in the whole world, so they should watch him. On the same day, the father of the assistant of the second son, who was in charge of the financial department, came to the leader's evening tea party and asked if the leader was happy for his son. The man was quite reserved, so he replied in a serious tone that it was too early to rejoice because Hen had only just won a small duel. The guest emphasized that the young man could not even hold a spoon properly in his hands, and here is such a success, so one cannot devalue such an achievement like that. Pouring another cup of tea into his glass, the head of the family asked his interlocutor if he also thought that Hen was a genius. The gentleman clearly replied that he agreed with this 100%, and only after these words could the leader smile broadly with the joy that overwhelmed him. Then the guest put his hands to the side and said that the financial situation was not the best, but he would still direct all his efforts to support Hen. The father put his hand on his heart and emphasized that Hen's son is a great kid, and it is not because he is his child, but because he learned martial arts. The interlocutor enthusiastically added that not only the technique inspires respect, but also courage and the right attitude simply know no bounds in the ratio. Then both men began to laugh out loud and sincerely because they could not afford to show emotion immediately after the fight because no one would understand them. At the same time, in another manner, a doctor was bandaging the entire body of the injured young man in a duel while he just lay motionless on his bed. The father quietly entered the room and asked the doctor how his son was doing and how long he would have to stay in this condition to recover. The man said that the young man has 14 fractures, 30 cracks in the bone, and his whole body is bruised, and recovery may take from a month to 2. After a short pause, the doctor added that it was fortunate that Jung was a warrior who had undergone a lot of training, because if he had been an ordinary person, he would have died long ago. When the father and son were alone, the man stood over the bed for a long time and looked at the boy carefully, thinking about everything that had happened today. 1 second, he was angry that his sons had been beaten by his nephew and mentally promised himself that he would never forgive him. The next morning, the second son's assistant brought several mugs of the herb broth, and the young man took it immediately without hesitation. Hen was even more excited about his victory today than yesterday, because finally he was able to show everyone that his treatment was not in vain and that he should continue. The girl was a little angry at this self-confidence, so she demonstrated it with her whole body, and the young man asked what was wrong with her face. The lady clarified what he didn't like about her expression, and he said that her eyes were glowing with suspicion. As Hen poured himself another 2 cups of drink, his assistant asked him a question to find out what secret he used to win. Then she put her hands to her sides and explained her question by saying that the result was so unbelievable. Later, she said again that she just wanted to know how the leader's second son managed to defeat the sword, the tiger, because he had studied the art of fighting for many years. After listening carefully to all the questions, the young man tipped the jug and began to drink the contents, and when he finished, he said that it was definitely not a tiger sword, but a kitten. The assistant did not react to these words, but instead put forward a new assumption of her own, that the senior heir had used a disguise and came out instead of Hen. This made the guy very angry, so he didn't think twice about throwing the bowl in the other woman's face and told her in a rude tone to bring snacks. The upset girl went out into the corridor and angrily said that he would continue to drink without snacks, so that later he would get gastritis and get what he deserved. Picking up the cup, the young man reasoned that since he had defended his father's post, there should be no problems with the supply of potions, even though they had little money. What happened next confused the young man a bit, because he noticed that his hands began to change from circles to blue, and he became a little worried. Then he dropped the vessel on the floor and grabbed his shirt in the area of his heart, because that's where he felt a sharp and acute pain. Leaning on the wall with one hand, the young man tried to breathe deeply and found out that his energy flow decided to close right then and there. Sweat began to appear all over the guy's body, and he still could not understand why the stream was closing, since he had only recently opened it. In order not to waste time, the second son of a respectable family opened the door to the street and decided that he had to do something immediately before the stream closed. The guards who were on duty that night saw the young man and could not understand what he was doing on the street at such a late hour and why he was constantly looking around. Then he turned sharply to face the two, and his expression frightened them, but his tone of voice frightened them even more. The guy came up close to them and, with his mouth wide open, loudly asked where they had some medicine because he was feeling unwell. While the young man was looking for something suitable, he said to himself that he had finally put this body in order, and she wanted to go back to the past again. And it turns out that the technique of the Dark King Chang Chong is not enough, and in order to control his condition, he definitely needs his potion. Opening box after box, the boy convinced himself that if he could find Dai Huan Dan's or Dai Chang Dan's potion, everything would be even better. Finally, he managed to find some potion in one box and decided to eat it all at once, because according to his version, quantity goes into quality. That same evening, a doctor came to the gentleman in charge of finances and told him that the potion that came today was of the highest quality. Then the financier said that it took a little bit of extra money to do this, and that the doctor now had to treat the young man properly so that he would not have any claims later. The guest put his hand on his heart and happily said that he could rely on him because they had a potion that could treat Heng for almost a year. When the meeting was over, the doctor went outside and said to himself that if he managed to cure the young man, he would have a higher status. Before he went home to rest, the man decided to visit his workplace and once again review the new useful potion. However, as soon as he grabbed the handle of the front door, he flew back a few meters with it because someone pushed it. As soon as the dust settled a little, the doctor began to carefully get up from under the door and looked around, trying to understand what had happened. The guards quickly rushed to the scene and also began to discuss among themselves what had happened to the warehouse of medicines, because nothing is clear yet. In a few minutes, everyone simultaneously felt a pungent odor that was very unpleasant, and so everyone quickly covered their noses to avoid breathing it. A few minutes later, the dust and smoke finally cleared, and the guards noticed and heard someone coughing loudly in the room. And when we looked closer, we realized that it was a young man who was in the room during the explosion and was heavily inhaled by the acrid smoke. And because of this, he just collapsed to the floor unconscious, and the soldiers quickly went to him to get him and find out about his condition. However, as soon as they approached, they saw that the gentleman began to slowly rise on his own, and large veins began to appear on his naked body. The senior guard turned to his partner and told him that everything that had happened had to be immediately reported to the family leader, and it had to be done now. At that time, the victim was standing in one position, almost unmoving, taking deep breaths and long exhalations, and concluded that he had first died and then revived. In a matter of seconds, he jumped to his feet and looked simply stunning, as there was not a single bruise or scratch on his body. The security guard, with his mouth wide open in surprise, asked what had happened here, because there had been an explosion that had been followed by unpleasant smoke. At this time, the doctor had already run into the warehouse with the medicines and picked up one of the boxes and began to shout loudly that his newest medicine was not there. Heng cautiously approached the man and calmly told him that he had eaten it all, and the man asked if he had done it all in one go. The young man then came even closer to the doctor and exhaled dark, stinky air from his mouth into his face, asking if there was a problem. The gentleman hid from the unpleasant smell, then covered his nose with his hand and said that he could not take them without permission, even in a small dose. This statement did not embarrass Hen at all, so he began to walk to his house, smiling broadly and emphasizing that his body had become better. The doctor was so upset and worried about what had happened that his nose was bleeding and tears were flowing from his eyes. At this time, Heng's assistant was walking down the hallway toward the gentleman's room, bringing him the snacks he had requested on a tray. However, when she entered the building, she did not notice the young man and, looking around, could not understand where he could have gone. Suddenly, she heard a voice outside and went out to see the leader's second son sitting on the roof with both legs dangling. The young man said that he had come up here to think about something in silence, and if she had nothing else to say to him, she could leave. After he was left alone, he raised his head high up the mountain and began to think about how he needed a lot of potions to break through all the energy flows. After an hour of such thinking, Hen came to the conclusion that, in any case, he had done everything right, so these threads should not be closed anymore. Then he was going to carefully jump off the roof, but when he landed, the ground beneath him cracked, and so the young man discovered that his bones had become stronger. Studying his body, the young man realized that his joints no longer fall out and even stopped crunching, and all because all the energy was released. Walking to his room, Hen couldn't even imagine how much more energy he would have when he could break through all the streams, but he was very interested. At a regular meeting of the elders, one of the men said that there were rumors that the young man's condition was getting better and better every day. Another gentleman, smiling sweetly, said that they still say that talent does not immediately reveal itself. It seems that Hen also just showed his capabilities late. The head of the family tried to react calmly to all these phrases, and therefore, to end the whole show, said that he was very grateful to the elder for his help. The man who was sitting closest to the leader turned to him and said that it was time to move on to the topic for which the leader had gathered them here. And then, the gentleman said that during the fight, his son had demonstrated how capable he was, and that's why he wanted to entrust him with the leadership of a small army. One of the elders calmly reacted to this decision, but decided that it was too early to trust Hen with such a thing, even though he had learned martial arts. Other members of the meeting began to support these words, arguing that a person's martial art is not related to his or her commanding talents. My father was a little upset by this reaction and began to think about what he had done wrong to make them not want to agree with his idea. Suddenly, during this awkward pause, the voice of a man whose sons had been beaten sounded, and he said with a mysterious look and tone that it could be tried. Then he looked at all the gentlemen present and explained that, as the leader said, the young gentleman's talent was unique, so there was no reason to stop. The participants could not change their minds just like that. They had to think it over carefully, because it might seem like a premature decision. The father of the victims began to convince them that the young man had overcome 9 energy flows and had succeeded. After a short pause, he added that even if we assume that he will not succeed, it can generally remain in his experience. All the members of the meeting began to look at each other because none of them wanted to take responsibility for speaking for everyone. This silence was nevertheless broken by one man who said that these words seemed right to him because gaining experience is also necessary. The head of the family turned his gaze to the father of the beaten sons and thanked him with a serious expression for such words and thoughts about his child. The man looked directly into the eyes of his interlocutor and said that there was no need to thank him for it because he had just done it for the future of his family. The gentleman, who at first did not support the idea, decided to agree to it, as he was more than willing to do so, and immediately asked what kind of army they would entrust to their second son. At these words, the leader revived a little, and with a smile on his face, was about to say which army he had decided to entrust to his son. However, he didn't have time to say anything because he was interrupted by a gentleman with a twisted expression and said that we could try to pass the troops of the Thunder Dragon. The head of the family thought he had heard it, so he asked the gentleman to repeat it again, and he said that Hen would be matched by the Thunder Dragon army. At the meeting, my father began to worry about the proposed army because it included rude and disorderly people who were constantly causing problems. Everyone began to discuss among themselves again whether they really needed it because it could cause many problematic situations for the family. Uncle said that he really wanted to entrust the Thunder Dragon army to his son Jung, but since Hyun had defeated him, he had to do it. After these words, all the members of the meeting put their heads down and began to think again about all the pros and cons of their further decision. Suddenly, one gentleman said that it would be a good chance to test the young gentleman's abilities and that he would be able to demonstrate his uniqueness. A man with a distorted expression turned to the leader and asked if he wanted to give up because this army could complicate his rule. The head of the family angrily clenched his hands into fists and was angry that if he refused now, the authority of his second son might be shaken. Immediately after the meeting, the father told his son that he had to agree to the decision, and the son reacted happily and was even happy about it. The head of the family decided to inform his son in a serious tone that the Dragon Army is not the kind of guys who will do everything they are told. And a second later, the man added that they fight all day long and don't listen to anyone at all. Hen, smiling broadly, emphasized that it was good that he was healthy. Seeing such enthusiasm in his son, the father decided to inform him about the army, saying that there are always bad rumors about these guys. Therefore, they cannot be dealt with in the usual way. The second son continued to smile, saying that they could simply be beaten. Dad said that they had already tried this method, and it did not work on them because they were very stubborn and continued to behave terribly. After a short pause, the young man smiled broadly again and suggested that they probably hadn't been beaten enough to understand. The family leader did not expect his son Hen to take the news so easily, as he is facing a task that is not the easiest. Word of the new appointment quickly spread throughout the town, and one of the members of the dragon's army quickly began to rush to the head to tell him everything. The leader of this army had several scars on his face that he had received during fights. Raising his glass, he asked his subordinate why he was so loud. And in a second, the guy said that they decided to give them to his second son, which made everyone present laugh because they, like everyone else, knew about the gentleman's health. After a short pause, the subordinate added that this decision had been made at the last meeting of the elders, and the leader of the army froze in his seat. And then he clutched his glass tightly in his hands and said that these old men decided to throw a brainless, weak sheep to the hungry jackals. The man looked at one point with bulging eyes when he said that they probably needed to be shown who they were so that they would come to their senses again and change everything. The subordinate said, with his hands to the side, that there was no need to look down on Hen, because in the last fight, he had defeated the tiger with one blow. They were curious about how the fight really took place, so a friend sitting next to them turned to everyone present and asked if anyone had seen it with their own eyes. The guys said that they had gotten very drunk the day before, and instead of going to watch the match, they slept in their rooms all day. A subordinate of the troop leader was tormented by this behavior of his colleagues and asked them if they really thought it was something to be proud of. The boss said that it didn't matter who Hen was, because no matter who was in charge, nothing would change, and if he pestered them, they would just show him where the crayfish hid. The assistant listened attentively to this speech, and then smiled sweetly and asked the gentleman if he was going to harm the young master. For this question, he was punched in the face and reproached for thinking that members of a respectable family's army could harm their second son. Then the leader, showing his fist to all those present, angrily said that he had just decided to teach this fry a life he had never even dreamed of. A friend who was sitting next to me at the time smiled broadly and said that the chief should be a little more gentle because a sick person would come to them. Suddenly, a voice they had never heard before interrupted all this banter, and it was he who asked who should take over the life of whom. As it turned out, they were visited by Hen, who, folding his arms across his chest, emphasized that they had a pretty great life if they could afford to drink in the morning. The leader turned to his comrade to find out who the guest was, and the latter whispered quietly that it seemed to be the young gentleman who was to lead them. Then Hen sat down on a chair at the table where the leader was sitting, and everyone around him froze in their seats because no one knew what to do or how to behave. A subordinate of the leader of the dragon army dared to say that the young man seemed to be quite healthy and had a good energy of life. The young man did not react to these words. Instead, he raised one glass and asked for it to be filled for him, and his request was immediately fulfilled. The leader of the army was surprised to ask whether the second son of a respectable family was really able to cope with the 9 yin energy flows that were destroying his health. After taking one sip of the drink, the guy said that he had just pierced one, but it decided to close, and he had to sweat to open it again. The chief asked if it would be better for the young man to spend his time in warmth and peace in his room, since he had not fully recovered. Hen said that to open other streams, he would need them, and the leader began to say that the guest had probably already heard who they were and what they were capable of. The second son of a respectable family propped up his face with both hands and pretended to listen attentively to everything they were going to say. And so the man with the scars on his face said that they would pretend to obey their master, and he would pretend to command them. The blonde guest clarified that then they would continue to have fun, just as one of the members of the army did not like it and hit the table with his fists. The leader turned to his friend, who was overwhelmed with emotion, and told him to calm down, because after all, they were talking to a young gentleman. Then Hyon decided to tell the members of the army the unpleasant truth, namely, that they were from poor families and therefore did not have the respect of their families. None of those present were pleased to hear this truth about themselves, but no one interrupted, and when the gentleman finished, the leader asked if he had said everything. The guy smiled sweetly afterwards and said that he just wanted to make an elite army out of useless jerks that everyone in the town would respect. Suddenly, the young man noticed that members of the army were approaching him from all sides, who were clearly not satisfied with what they had heard from the new leader. A second later, the leader abruptly got to his feet, along with his closest comrade, and was already thinking of just leaving the room. The chief explained that if the troops get really angry, even he won't be able to stop them, so he wants to take this responsibility on himself. When the assistant noticed his master's condition, he stood in front of him and said in a calm tone that he could endure everything because he was the son of the main family. But somehow it had the opposite effect on the man with the scars on his face, and he turned around and swung his fist and threatened the manager. Hang was more satisfied with this reaction because he had expected it, so he said that he had finally seen a true warrior who could only bark. The chief viscount was even more enraged, so he opened his mouth wide and shouted loudly that the gentleman would now regret his coming here. As soon as he finished the last word, he was hit in the face by a bullet from the manager, who decided to show this impudent man who was in charge. The impact was so severe that the victim flew several meters, broke through one railing of the stairs, and fell from the second floor to the first. The leader's assistant and best friend quickly ran to the edge of the stairs to see what had happened to the gentleman and whether they could help. The man was lying on the floor with his legs and arms spread wide in different directions, and it seemed to everyone that he had fainted. Seeing this state of the man, the two simultaneously drew their swords, turned to Hen, and threatened him with retribution for this act. In a few seconds, the young man was surrounded by other members of the army, who called him a bastard and asked him how he dared to do this to their leader. The new head did not answer. Instead, he quickly set fire to the thin sticks he was holding in his hand, and as soon as they started shooting, everyone was hit. Looking at everyone on the floor, the second son of a respectable family said that he had just seen that they knew what loyalty meant when they stood up for their leader. But then he emphasized that they were still stupid, because when they saw his attack, they should have realized that their forces were not equal, so there was no point in fighting. The chief's assistant and best friend froze in their seats with their eyes and mouths wide open because they had not expected to see such a thing. Suddenly, one warrior slowly raised his head and looked at the blond young man and said that it was not fair to use weapons here. The young man put one of the sticks to his temple and asked since when these wooden objects are considered weapons, as he had never heard of such things. Then the young man sat down next to the victim and looked him in the eye, saying that if we talk about honesty, they might be liars. Without waiting for an answer, the young man smilingly emphasized that they should be brought back to life, even though they were so talentless and resentful of this world. The warrior replied that they would rather die than bow down to anyone. And for these words, the leader took out a wand and stuck it into one of the interlocutor's hands. The leader's assistant and best friend were pale from what they saw, because they could not understand how the heir to such a family could be so cruel. After dealing with the young man, the second son approached the two and asked them what they were going to do next. The two men looked at each other and began to think about what they should do. The comrade said that there was no need to think long, because they needed revenge. So he took out an axe, with which he was going to join the battle, but his assistant said that he was a little afraid of the new leader's wands. The interlocutor drew attention to the guest and emphasized that he had no more chopsticks in his hands and that this moment should be quickly seized. And because of this, they both decided to attack this impudent person at the same time, but the attack should be made from both sides to dispel attention. In order to increase the distance between them, the young man jumped high up, and it was so powerful that it even broke the roof of the building. He was followed by two attackers, who looked at the opponent and asked if he was going to run away from them like that. And then the leader spread his arms and legs to the sides, and one could see that he had mini-sticks made of metal in his palms. Seeing the reaction of the two attackers, the guy began to smile slyly, and you could tell by his expression that they were in trouble. However, the second son decided not to hurt them too much, so he only scared them a little and twisted them to put them all in a net of laces. And then he hung this net over the lake. When the other members of the army started to wake up, they could not understand where they were and who did this to them. After a few minutes of this, the new warden, who was sitting nearby, addressed the prisoners and asked with a smile if everyone was awake. The leader of the army tried to find out from Heng what it all meant, and he took one sip of tea and asked if they didn't understand it themselves. The chief was furious at this wording, so he grabbed the net and threatened the gentleman that he would not get away with such an act. The second son of a respectable family replied that this did not scare him at all, and then reached for the lever and pulled it and lowered the entire army underwater. As soon as all the men were under the water, they quickly covered their noses and mouths to preserve the air they had left. For a few minutes, the young man stood there smiling and watched the water bubble up at the spot where his men had fallen because they were moving around. Then he went back to the lever and began to slowly lift the soldiers to the surface, and as soon as they were above the water, they began to breathe deeply. Hen greeted them with a big smile and folded his arms across his chest and asked if they had come to their senses when they finally bathed in the cold water. The leader spoke on behalf of everyone and first called the new leader disgusting and then ordered them to untie them immediately before it was too late. However, the guy did not even want to listen to such an appeal to himself, and because of this, he pushed the lever again, and they all ended up under cold water. At this time, his assistant came to the gentleman and brought him snacks. When she saw what he was doing, he said that he did what he had planned. When they sat down on the floor of the gazebo, The girl said that she thought Hen would only scare them, but the man said that this approach would not work on them. Then the girl turned her gaze to the lake and asked if the guy had been keeping them there too long, since quite a bit of time had passed. The second son took one snack and brought it to his mouth and looked at the lake, but did not even move to do anything. Seeing this reaction, the frightened assistant began to say nervously that they could not do this because they would drown and become water ghosts. When she said these words, she believed them strongly and grabbed her head and shouted loudly that the soldiers could really die there. The new manager, taking a sip of chamomile tea, turned his gaze to his assistant and, putting his hand on the lever, asked why she was so noisy. In a few seconds, people were already rising above the water and taking deep breaths of air again, and Hen asked them if they were ready to listen to him. The best friend of the army leader coughed and asked the young man what he wanted from them, which made the young man happy, and he smiled happily. And then, with a sharp change in his face and becoming more serious, he said that everything was very simple. They had to obey him completely and follow all his orders. The leader of the army did not even want to hear this, so he sent a new leader farther away and again told them to untie them and let them go in a commanding tone. The guy expected such a response, so he pulled the lever and lowered them back under the water and turned to his assistant and asked her to pour him more tea. While underwater, the chief reasoned that they needed to be patient because this guy was definitely not going to take their lives. For a few minutes, he mentally convinced himself that he had to be patient, but when the manager did not pick them up for a long time, he began to panic. And just after that, the second son of a respectable family lifted them up. After staying in the air for a few minutes, the gentleman asked the soldiers if they had caught their breath. The leader was unrepentant and showed an obscene gesture to the offender and said that they would never listen to him, even if they were forced to die. Hen didn't have to think about it for a long time. With a wave of his hand, he made them go back underwater and think about their future. In a few minutes, he was slowly lifting them over the water again. The soldiers were all quite exhausted from having to constantly change their breathing. The leader's best friend, having caught his breath, tried to say something to the young gentleman. But the man did not even begin to listen. Instead, he interrupted the man and said for him that he did not want to surrender, so he put them underwater again. When the new leader raised his army over the water, one of the soldiers shouted loudly for someone to save them. However, immediately after that, they found themselves underwater again and began to think that he could really take their lives like that. As soon as Hyun, once again, raised the troops above the water, one of them shouted that they were ready to surrender and obey their new leader. The young gentleman asked them if they had thought it through and if their words were sincere, to which they replied that he could trust them. After taking one sip of chamomile tea, the boy said that he did not really believe in the sincerity of these words, so he put them back underwater. The leader of the army could not stand it any longer and fainted. Hen took him out and laid him on the ground to bring him to life by pouring tea on him. When the man opened his eyes, he saw a smiling blonde young man who said that he thought they were not so tough and resilient. The commander of the troops quickly knelt down and apologized to Hyun, and then said that he would serve him, not only him, but all of them. Seeing the unhappy expressions on the faces of the soldiers, the young man pulled out his sword and said that as proof, one of them would now have to say goodbye to his life. And then he explained that he was simply convinced that for the sake of order, a few needed to be killed, so that the rest would obey and know the consequences. Putting the sword on his shoulder, Hen said that the only problem is that they are all so sharp that even here there could be some trouble. The leader pitifully said that they had already sworn their allegiance to him, and he still needed some innocent victim, and asked why he needed it. The young man did not respond to this, but instead raised his sword up in the air and addressed everyone and said to choose one of them to be killed. Then the new leader started counting down from 3, and the leader of the army asked for more time because they needed to discuss everything with each other. The countdown was over, and since no candidate was nominated, he swung and struck the closest person, who turned out to be the leader himself. All the warriors froze in their seats in shock and fright, because none of them expected this young man to be able to actually fulfill his plan. In a few minutes, it became clear that he had not killed the head of the army, but the tip of his sword had deeply wounded the man's forehead, and so he bled. Heng explained his action by saying that today's drink was quite tasty, and he decided to postpone the execution, but do not think that he is canceling it. The leader could not even say anything, because he simply did not expect that he would be the one against whom the second son of a respectable family would raise his weapon. At the same second, his assistant appeared behind the guy and, smiling broadly, said that she had brought additional drinks. Gently tapping the young lady on the head with his sword, the guy said that 100 years ago he sent her to get a supplement, and she was lost. The lady handed the gentleman several mugs and shouted angrily that at first she could hardly find the supplement in the city and then did not know how to bring it herself. At this time, the members of the army began to look at each other because they realized that no one was watching them because the two were busy with each other. So they decided that this could be a chance for them to escape, but as soon as they took a few steps, the new leader asked them where they were going. The leader put his hands forward and frightenedly began to explain that they just wanted to rest after such a hard day. But this explanation did not satisfy the young gentleman, and he threw his sword at the man so hard that he flew back several meters. After a short pause, the young man shouted that they probably hadn't understood him yet because no one had the right to go on vacation until he let them go. The victim was holding his nose as blood began to flow from it and said that it was really their mistake and that they had misunderstood everything. Then Hen pointed back with his right thumb and said that before they left, they had to clean up some things behind him. When everyone looked back, they couldn't figure out what exactly they needed to clean up, so the guy showed them the structure for lowering underwater. Smiling sarcastically, the young man said that it was built specifically for their training, so they were the ones who had to disassemble it. The men were shocked, to put it mildly, because it would take at least several hours, and they were so tired that they had no strength. However, they had no other option. So after completing the task in many hours, the men carried the logs on which Hen was sitting all the way to the town. Everyone was so overwhelmed that they could no longer walk evenly, so there were interruptions, and everyone exploded with their emotions and shouted at their neighbors. The new manager was angry that his cart was constantly shaking, and the drink he poured for himself spilled and he couldn't drink it properly. Early in the morning, one of his subordinates came running to the man with a distorted expression and wanted to tell him about the Thunder Dragon army. Without hearing a word, the gentleman already assumed that these weirdos had already done something, and that it was not in vain that he had decided to give them to Hen as a bail bond. Recoiling, the subordinate began to say that when he saw their appearance, he was frightened, to put it mildly, because they did not look the same as before. The uncle smilingly said that he knew that this army was full of bastards, and then asked how badly they had beaten the second son of a respectable family. The confused guest tried to say that the gentleman seemed to have misunderstood him, but the man was already getting angry, so he clarified what was going on. He replied that it was not Hen's appearance that raised questions, but the soldiers, and then added that they had come to the town and were completely obeying him. After listening carefully to all this information, the man with a distorted expression opened his mouth wide in surprise, because he had not expected this. This morning, the blond young man had breakfast with his favorite dish, namely dumplings, which his assistant had prepared and brought to him. It turned out that he and the girl were sitting on the logs that his subordinates were carrying again, and he wanted to hear the phrase "total devotion" clearly and loudly. The men were so tired that they could not even carry anything. They could barely stand on their feet, but they tried to say everything that was wanted to be heard from them. The lady folded her arms across her chest and asked the gentleman if it was time to stop, because people were already feeling bad, and he might overdo it. The guy replied that it was not time to finish yet, because he needed to bring these impudent people to the end of their rope, and the girl was sure that he had already done it to them long ago. Then the young gentleman went to the edge of the logs and looked down and said that the most effective way to make the opponent surrender was through pain and fear. Only when they feel this will their horror reach their very bones, and they will truly obey him and be ready to follow all his orders. At the same time, their uncle was watching from a high mountain and could not believe his eyes because the Thunder Dragon army had so strongly submitted to Hen. The man's interlocutor began to explain that everything that was happening now was just a flower, because what had happened a few hours ago was just horrible. After all, they had to count numbers only up to the specified number, and if one of them made a mistake and said it out loud, the punishment was doubled. Watching this action for a few minutes, the elder gritted his teeth and said that these words alone took his breath away. The man in black went on to say that some family members had already seen the army with their own eyes, and they were pleased that Hen had managed to pacify them. The man just couldn't believe his ears, so he asked again if the family members could really like it, or if the boy had confused something. The interlocutor replied that they even said they liked such focused training, but the gentleman did not think so, because it looked like torture to him. The black-clad man turned his gaze to the elder and emphasized that the attempt to create problems for the young master through the Thunder Dragon army had failed. Meanwhile, Hen continued his training, ordering his subordinates to count loudly, but his assistant was not happy to see her there. As soon as the training was over and all the members of the army were free, they went to the dining room where they lay down on the tables because they were very tired. Some of them did not even have the strength to lift a spoon, while others tried to have a snack to recuperate a bit for further training. When the leader of the army was about to drink the soup, someone passed by and pushed him, and the bowl fell to the floor and all the contents spilled. The man was very angry about it, but he simply did not have the strength to prove anything to anyone. All he could do was look at the person who did it. It was a young man with black dreadlocks on his head, and he raised his hands in the air and apologized, saying that he did not know that the leader was so weak. It turns out that he is not a simple guy, but the head of the army, Hyun Mu. But the leader did not want to talk to them, so he asked him to leave as soon as possible. However, he had no intention of leaving, so he looked around and said that the young man had treated them a bit harshly, and they had already obeyed him. The best comrade of the leader of the Thunder Dragon army loudly banged his fist on the table and said angrily that there was probably someone here who wanted to die. The boss turned to his friend and asked him to calm down because they didn't know how their new boss would react to the noise. The man held back his emotions and put his head down, suggesting that as soon as he found out, he would get angry and beat them all up again. Then the guy with the dreadlocks asked if they were really going to endure all this, and after a short pause, added that they could get sick from so much stress. The leader jumped to his feet and asked the interlocutor to be moderate in his statements, and the latter, in turn, began to provoke him by recalling the past. Of course, this could not but anger the gentleman, so he quickly turned his face in the opposite direction and closed his eyes and tried to control his state. The guy who was standing behind me continued to say offensive things, namely, that as soon as the young man called them with his finger, they would immediately run to him. This statement of the facts seriously angered the chief of the army, so he grabbed the interlocutor by the shirt and threatened to punch him. The guy with the dreadlocks, smiling broadly, asked the gentleman why he was threatening him, and then suggested that he would have to answer to his boss for everything. Just as he was about to strike back at him for saying that, a rather familiar voice was heard behind him, which frightened and confused the commander. At that moment, Heng entered the room, stopped at the entrance, folded his arms across his chest, and asked if his subordinate was really fighting. The other members of the army also got to their feet and turned to their master, because none of them expected him to witness such unpleasant events. Instead, he laughed out loud and asked why they had all stopped eating, since he had not come here to distract them from an important matter. Then the young man turned his gaze to the leader of the army and the young man with dreadlocks, and looked them up and down and asked what they were doing there. The main man quickly bounced off his opponent and explained that the latter's clothes were simply wrinkled, and he decided to help him straighten them out a bit. However, the guest began to deny all this. Holding his throat, he began to say that they started to attack him here, and at the end, they grabbed him by the throat. The subsequent reaction of the second son surprised everyone present, especially the leader, because he said that they could complete everything they had started. Seeing the misunderstanding in the eyes of the audience, the man explained that the two could fight, and once they started, they had to finish it. Stopping at the exit, Khan added that if the leader of the army is beaten and sees this, he will regret not dying immediately, because he will be punished. After closing the door loudly, the gentleman said that they should decide for themselves whether to fight or not, and immediately after that, his subordinate punched the guest in the face. This made the guy take a few steps back and fall to the floor, and his comrades in the lead troop began to support him with words. Then the gentleman showed his fist to the victim and explained that his supervisor had ordered them to deal with the guest because they had to be worthy of their teacher. A guy with dreadlocks, holding his nose, which was bleeding, asked if the man really thought he would be unharmed after that. The leader said that there was no difference and then ordered his troops to attack, and so everyone chose an opponent and fought with him. Various techniques and methods were used, and different parts, from the head to the legs, were used until the young lord's warriors won. When the guest saw that his friends were losing, he shouted with his mouth wide open that they should immediately hit back because it could end badly. After a short pause, the guy wanted to add that they were outnumbered, but he could not do so because the leader of the army was already flying at him. As the man approached his opponent, he emphasized that he should take better care of himself, as there was a high probability of getting hurt badly. And in a matter of seconds, the guy with the dreadlocks found himself face down on the floor, with a tray on his back that seemed very heavy. That evening, an urgent meeting of the elders was convened to discuss the fight and its consequences. The gray-haired man looked down and said sadly that they were all considered one family, so he did not understand how this had happened at all. Other members of the meeting began to say that they had heard rumors that the young man had been able to subdue the Thunder Dragon army, and now this news. The father was not pleased to hear that his second son was being spoken about in such a negative way, because he, like everyone else, thought he was doing a good job. So he decided that this time he would not explain anything, and that his child, who was standing behind him with his arms folded across his chest, would do it. He said that like all young men, they had just had a fight, and then emphasized that there were also injured among his soldiers. After these words, the uncle jumped to his feet and shouted that it was really fair, and asked if the young man thought his words were harsh. Then the elder said that the Thunder Dragon army had only 3 light wounds and 4 medium wounds, and that was nothing compared to the others. Hen replied in surprise that this simply could not be so his uncle asked him again whether he had finally realized the seriousness of the problem. At this time, the commander of the army was thinking out loud that the enemy managed to wound a total of 7 of his men, so he would teach them a lesson, because it was a big number. These reflections are interrupted by one of the elders who says that since Hen is responsible for the Thunder Dragon army, he should be the one to bear the punishment for this act. Other members of the meeting disagreed and suggested that all the soldiers, along with their leader, should be punished, and that it should be severe. My uncle was very happy about this decision, and the thought crossed his mind that due to the severity of the punishment, his second son's authority could fall sharply. But then something happened that no one expected. The silence was broken by the new commander of the army, who asked if they really had to endure the attacks. Then he began to explain that they did not start the conflict, and asked again that shouldn't we respond to such an attitude in kind. Only then did the members of the assembly realize that these words might be true, and even one of the elders said out loud that they should not be the ones to be punished. The uncle was very angry that his colleagues could be manipulated so easily and could change their minds in a second. So he quickly approached Heng and told him not to try to change the conversation because there were more serious injuries in the other army. After this accusation, the guy made a pitiful expression on his face and said that if they decide to punish them, they are ready for it. But a second later, he added that they were ready to be punished, only after the enemy troops who started the fight were punished. The uncle was shocked by these words, and the young man asked questions to find out under whose responsibility Hyun Moo's army was. The elders said that Nam Gun Paek was responsible for this army, and that he would be punished for the conflict. The man was seriously angry and nervous that he had been betrayed by his own people like that, because he could not even imagine that there would be such consequences. Looking directly into the eyes of his interlocutor, the young man held his hand to the side and said that all those responsible would be punished fairly. And after a short pause, the guy smiled broadly and emphasized that their family has been proud of its honesty between all members for centuries. This statement of facts did not make the uncle very happy, and he gritted his teeth in anger and began to sweat on his face from excitement. For several minutes, they stood and looked into each other's eyes, each trying to prove their confidence and ability to respond according to their deserts. At that moment, Hen thought that this was his uncle's way of teaching him a lesson, but he was not young and had experience in such matters. Then the gentleman turned to his colleagues with a distorted expression and asked if it was possible for each manager to order his subordinates independently. The gray-haired elder looked around and said that he fully agreed with this idea and that there was no point in making a big deal out of it now. The second son of a respectable family was very pleased with this decision, and folding his arms as if in prayer, turned to his uncle and thanked him for the idea. The man was angry about this, and it could be seen in the way he drew his eyebrows together and clenched his teeth tightly to keep from saying anything unnecessary. At this time, all the perpetrators of the fight were put in prisons, guarded by a large number of guards to ensure that no one could escape. The army leader's best friend was lying on the floor holding his stomach and regretting that he hadn't finished all the dumplings during lunch and had gotten into a fight. And the assistant chief said that he was not sure what he was thinking about because they were sitting here and did not know what punishment the elders would impose on them. The leader of the Thunder Dragon troops turned to his comrades and said that they should not lose heart early, but simply wait calmly. After these words, the door to the cell opened and a guard appeared, who said in a serious tone that they were all being released. All this looked strange to the soldiers, so they kept asking the guards if they were being released without any punishment from the elders. When they left the prison, the soldiers could not understand how they were released so easily after what had happened. But later, it became clear that Hen had done it. The assistant leader was glad that they now had a reliable rear that could stand up for them, but the main leader said it was too early to rejoice. When the leader of the army stopped, He began to look at his subordinates and realized that they had indeed begun to trust and obey the new leader completely. The guard, seeing such joy, turned to the former prisoners and told them that the young gentleman himself would come up with a punishment for them, so it was too early to be so happy. When the leader heard these words, he just froze in place, because fear permeated his entire body, because they know better than anyone what their new leader can come up with. The warrior, seeing the confusion in the eyes of the prisoners, pointed his index finger up and emphasized that this decision was made at the meeting of the elders. As soon as all the soldiers of the Thunder Dragon heard these words, they went to their cells and said in fright that they would rather stay here than go free. The guards were trying their best to kick these insolents out into the street because they had been released and they had no right to keep them here without a proper order. However, after a few minutes, the prisoners slowly left the room, holding each other because it made everyone feel more comfortable. A young gentleman was waiting for them at the exit, and when they saw him, they all simultaneously folded their hands as if in prayer and bowed low, saying that they had come by his order. Heng looked at them all carefully and said that he had heard rumors that they had all asked the prison not to let them out. With excitement, the leader and his subordinates broke out in a cold sweat and raised their hands in the air to explain that they had actually been misunderstood. Then the manager said that he might have heard something wrong, and the chief took the opportunity to ask how he was going to punish them for the fight. The young man smiled and said that he was just saying that to calm the elders down, but he did not want to come up with a punishment for some childish fight. The best comrade of the warrior leader exhaled deeply and loudly, which he thought was unnecessary, and which showed that he had relaxed a bit. But then the men noticed a large wooden box standing next to the young man, so they asked him what was in it and why it was there. The new manager pushed this box. It fell, and large black weights, with chains and rings attached, rolled out of it in different directions. At that time, my uncle was in his house, throwing various objects at the walls out of anger, because his young nephew was able to humiliate him in front of everyone. The guy in black sat down and told the man not to be so upset about what had happened, because mistakes make us stronger and smarter. The gentleman was also worried that the elders had already begun to listen to this young man, and the interlocutor clarified whether the conflict had gone too far. The gentleman with the distorted expression on his face asked if the interlocutor had forgotten whose son Hyun was, and the stronger he became, the more his authority grew. And then the guy in black said that there was no way to compete with him within the family, because it was simply not possible as long as he had the support of the elders. And after these words, the man realized that he would deal with him from the outside. Although it would be a slow step, it would be more effective and less costly. At this time, the young master naturally punished his subordinates by tying the weights to the soldiers' legs and forcing them to move forward. They were walking very slowly and the leader did not like it, so he shouted at them that they could not be an elite army if they moved like turtles. All the soldiers quickly became covered with drops of sweat because it was so hard for them to walk, and with every step they took, they regretted leaving the prison at all. A few days after the punishment, the town was covered with light snow, which covered everything like a white sheet. In such cold weather, Hen felt bad, because it was in such weather that yin energy began to come out more actively, and because of this, he constantly sat wrapped around the fire. At this time, an assistant entered the room and smilingly announced that it was time for lunch, but this did not please the gentleman, but rather made him angry for some reason. But as it turned out, he didn't like the fact that there was no meat in any of the dishes. The girl explained that the family was having great financial difficulties. In winter, this situation happens all the time, but this year it was compounded by the fact that the man was taking a medicine that cost a lot of money, so for now the food will be like this. The young man angrily gritted his teeth, wrapped his arms around himself even tighter, and angrily asked if the girl wanted to say that he was the reason they were in this situation. The young lady, folding her arms across her chest, replied that this fact could not be denied, and then added that the portions of the potion would also be slightly reduced. On the same day, a group of men on horses were warmly dressed and moving through the forest while it was snowing heavily and the road in front was barely visible. And on their way, there was a stretched net, which, of course, they did not notice because of the bad weather, and the horses were frightened and began to disperse in different directions. Then torches with fire flew at this group of men and a herd of horses, which set fire to the long-prepared lacing, and it was placed around them. Suddenly, the group's leader noticed several people on the right side approaching them with their weapons and asked them who they were. They only smiled slyly in response, and the man suggested out loud that it could be a gang of kidnappers who specialize in horses. So the gentleman turned to his comrades and said that they had to leave immediately because these men looked completely frozen and scary. However, they had no chance to escape because the attackers used their weapons to surround the head and threatened him with death. The man tried to defend himself to the last and said that all these horses belonged to the In-Hyun stable, which belongs to the respected Nam-gun family. However, this did not stop the attackers. They still took the man's life and summarized it by saying that he could not even properly defend himself. When his friend saw that his friend was treated so brutally, he rode up on his horse and began to threaten the attackers because they were simply inhumane. The chief among the brigands raised his sword in the air and managed to strike the first blow at the lord on horseback, and he fell down screaming loudly in pain and shock. After that, the attacker smiled and said that there was no need to call them thieves because it spoiled their mood, because they were mountain bandits. Suddenly, this speech was interrupted by a voice coming from behind him, and when the man turned his head, he saw that there were soldiers on horseback holding swords. These 3 warriors intended to stop these robbers and deal with them right here and now so that no one else would suffer at their hands. The robbers assumed that they might be soldiers from a respectable family, and they were also surprised by the fact that they were surprisingly good at holding weapons. And of course, then there was the fight in which the first mountain bandit paid with his life for daring to attack the herders of the horses of a respectable family. And so it was with each of them until only the chief was left and a sword was put to his throat, and he was told that the best thing he could do was to surrender. But this did not frighten the man. He smiled lightly and asked a question to clarify whether they really thought they had attacked aimlessly. For a few seconds, these words made the warrior think, but then he noticed that another attacker was lying behind him with a sword in his hand. This helped the soldier to quickly move and put his weapon forward to prevent the first blow from taking his life. The clash of swords was so strong that the young man had to make every effort, and yet he felt that he would not be able to hold on for long. And it turned out to be completely true, because in a matter of seconds, this sword inflicted a wound that killed him, and there was no chance to escape. The other 2 soldiers froze in their seats with their mouths wide open because they had not expected this battle to end like this. And they realized that this was not just an ordinary robber, but a master in a fight, because they had never seen such skill before. The 2 warriors of the respected family looked at each other and decided that they would not give up, but would fight to the last, and began to attack from different sides. And constantly swinging their swords, they could not hit the opponent, who somehow managed to dodge them. As soon as the 2 of them stepped back a little to gain momentum, they did not return alive because the enemy used their weapons against them. One of the horse herders froze in place with his mouth wide open as he was shocked that the soldiers had not been able to show their full strength and had already died. But as it turned out, no one was going to leave him alone, because around him the man saw mountain bandits holding weapons. At this time, the leader of the thieves approached the master and folded his hands as if in prayer, saying that it was simply unbeatable to destroy the soldiers with a single blow. Hearing this, the gray-haired gentleman said that if it was the elite, he was very disappointed and began to walk deep into the forest, asking them to clean up everything. Finally, he said that all the horses should be taken away, but the bodies of the dead should be disposed of so that no one would find them and get on their trail. Everything that happened in the forest was watched by a black raven, which also accompanied the horses to the place where they were hidden and then headed home. He arrived just as the young gentleman was training his peebles to throw weights and catch them, all of them naked to the waist during the winter. The best comrade of the army leader closed his eyes and threw a weight with his last strength, shouting for his partner to catch it. But he froze in place with his mouth wide open in shock when he saw that it was not flying in his direction at all, but slightly to the right. However, having come to his senses in the last seconds, he still tried to catch the kettlebell and even fell to the ground to do so, but it was all in vain because he did not catch it. Everyone started shouting at the leader for failing to catch it, and when the leader saw this defeat, he said that they should all throw 100 times. While everyone was standing there doing nothing, Hen asked them why they weren't moving, or if he needed to leave them a little bit. Suddenly, a bird flying overhead caught the young man's eye and for some reason made him look up and watch it. At the same time, the thought flashed through his mind that he did not know where the crow came from, but he felt some strange vibrations. Then the young man turned his attention to the elders, who were walking in a group near their training grounds, and this also seemed surprisingly strange to him. Hen began to rub his chin in thought and wondered what had happened to make these people look so serious and walk around here. While he was thinking about this, he froze in place and didn't even notice that one of the weights that someone had launched unsuccessfully was flying at him. The leader and his best friend were seriously frightened when they saw what was about to happen and began to break out in cold sweat. However, in the last seconds, the new manager managed to catch the weight with one hand and angrily asked if they had done it on purpose. These two froze in their seats as if someone had dug them in and at the same time shook their heads from side to side because they could not say anything. The angry second son said that because of this situation, he was adding another 1,000 throws, and if someone didn't like it, he was ready to deal with him. At that time, the family leader was told the disappointing news that mountain bandits had attacked In Hyun's stable during a horse race. The person who brought the news emphasized that this was clearly not a simple enemy and clarified how simple mountain bandits could attack them like this in the middle of the day. The gray-haired elder looked down sadly and emphasized that their warriors should not have fallen at the hands of mountain bandits, so it was quite strange. The meeting could not decide what to do about it because the financial losses due to the kidnapping were great, plus the human cost. Today, everyone wanted to express their assumptions, so they talked to each other on the interruptions, and the leader just sat quietly, immersed in his thoughts. And then he interrupted the whole show by saying that he needed to send the best soldiers to the stables as soon as possible to deal with this situation. The gray-haired elder emphasized that their family needs to catch these robbers and restore family dignity and financial compensation. But immediately after this decision, the next logical question arose. Who can they send there, since all the elite troops are not in place now? The uncle decided that this was a good chance to get even with his nephew, so he called on everyone to nominate the Thunder Dragon warriors. At this suggestion, the leader froze in place with his mouth open, because it could also mean that his own son would be forced to go here as well. The gentleman with a distorted expression continued to say that they had not used them for a long time because there was no one who could properly manage them. However, now they have a young gentleman who is doing a good job with them so they can be entrusted with this task. The father looked down sadly and began to think about all the words he had said, while the other members of the meeting still saw the sense in this proposal. Everyone had almost agreed that this was how it was going to be. The only thing stopping them was that Heng had no experience in any serious combat. My uncle, clenching his hands into a fist, said that sooner or later he would need to gain this experience and that he would not be defeated by mountain bandits. After these words, everyone wondered how the young man managed to defeat the sword tiger and how he was able to subdue the troublesome army of the Thunder Dragon to his will. Then the gray-haired elder turned to the leader and said that he could not protect his son all the time, and it was time to let Hen prove himself. The man was in no hurry to answer. Instead, he turned his gaze to his brother and mentally asked him what he was up to and why everything was so complicated. Nevertheless, the decision was agreed upon, and in a few minutes the task was communicated to Heng, who was not at all confused, but rather excited. When the young master was joined by his assistant, he said that he was very happy because he had received a request to defeat the villains who had stolen the horses. The girl was surprised by such joy, and a few minutes later emphasized that 3 soldiers of their respected family were killed in the attack. Smiling, the guy said that by completing this task, he could bring some money, which they lacked so much now, so he would not miss it. Then the young man thought that if he could get into the hideout of the mountain robbers, he could find a mountain of money. The best comrade of the main army jumped up and down with joy because he had finally gotten rid of the weights and could rest and recover properly. They had already been told that in the morning they would have to go hunting for mountain bandits, and some of them were happy about it, while others were not. Suddenly, the soldiers heard a rather familiar voice in their room, and as it turned out, it was a young gentleman who smilingly said that they needed to go earn money. At that time, the uncle was looking at his faithful friend the pigeon when a guy in black came to him and said that Hen and his army had already set off. Then the man picked up his bird and attached a small piece of paper to its leg and brought it to the window and released it to carry the message. The gentleman, with a distorted expression, smiled broadly and contentedly, and said that he had probably lost the chance to see his nephew for the last time. Early in the morning, the owner of the stable, Sam Manchu, and his friend watched the horses calmly roaming and grazing in the corral. My friend told him not to be so upset because nothing could be done in this situation, and he said that the family suffered great losses because of this. Then the black-haired man drew his eyebrows together and told them that they should calm down because a respected family had sent their soldiers to help them. The owner looked in front of him and said that there might be some problems with this visit, and the interlocutor did not understand what they were at first. And then Sam Manchu was forced to explain that the elders had decided to send the young lord along with the Thunder Dragon army. A friend said that they were bad helpers because Hen suffers from 9 yin energy flows, and the army is generally known for hooliganism. The owner of the stable looked at himself and sadly said that he agreed with all the words said, but he could not challenge the decision of the respected family. Suddenly, this conversation was interrupted by one of the workers who pointed to the right and said that he had been informed that the family's soldiers had already entered the village. The men were surprised that they got there in 2 days, although it usually takes at least 6 days to get there, so it was a good wake-up call. So all the important people of the stable gathered together and headed to the entrance to meet their assistants in full force. And through the raised cloud of dust, it became apparent that many strong men were pulling a large wagon with their own strength and arms. Everyone was shocked that the soldiers were half-dressed, and yet they were pulling a cart for some reason. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the leader of the army who, with his mouth wide open, loudly informed everyone that a young gentleman was approaching the center. Therefore, all the soldiers took up the brooms they had brought with them and began to sweep the place where the carriage in which the second son of the honorable family was to arrive was to stop. The horse in the carriage was driven by the master's assistant, so as soon as she gave the order to stop, a red carpet was already laid out next to the carriage door. When Hen went outside, he first stopped in his tracks and yawned widely, saying that he was very tired from such a long journey. He then asked if it had helped his subordinates train in any way, and they said that it had made them stronger and more resilient. Straightening a strand of hair, the new manager said that in his opinion, the road was too short, so next time he should take a longer route. The owner of the stables approached Hyun and, folding his hands as if in prayer, said that his name was Sam Manchu, and added that he was glad to see the young gentleman here. The young man laughed and said that there could be no formalities between them, so he could be approached as conveniently as he liked. Next, Ha Tae-gon from the Kongon serfdom greeted the Hyung and said that he was honored to meet the second son of a respected family. The young man did not understand anything, so the owner of the stable began to explain to him that the Congo was an order that helped them during certain difficulties and trials. And finally, the owner of the stable added that this gentleman had volunteered to help them this time in connection with the recent events that had happened to them. Heng was not very happy with this news, because if there are any allies in this situation, he will not be able to get all the spoils on his own, he will have to share them. Then the assistant took out his sword and demonstrated it, saying that it was weak, but that he would do his best to help the young man. The second son of a respectable family ignored these words and instead came closer to the stable owner and asked what they were going to have for lunch. After a short pause, the man smiled and said that they had done their best to prepare delicious dishes for the meal. The black-haired gentleman told the new leader that they had also prepared food for his troops, and Hen said that they still had some training to do. All the warriors shouted in one voice that they remembered everything and then tied the weights to their feet and started moving forward for training. Some of them had tears in their eyes because they had traveled such a long way and had to train instead of rest. As soon as everyone entered the hall, the locals said that everything considered meat was on the table, so the gentleman could help himself. The young gentleman just pounced on the treats, and his assistant even made a remark about it, because from the outside, it looked like he was a glutton. The gentleman was enraged by this remark and approached the young lady and shouted loudly that if she had given him meat all the time, he would not have behaved like this. The lady wiped her face with the remnants of food and spoke to the locals to make them understand that the honorable family was in a difficult situation. The owner of the stable said they had enough meat to eat as much as they wanted and then offered a drink of warm horse milk. Having tasted the drink, the second son of a respectable family smiled broadly and said that the food here was delicious, like in a top-level restaurant. The assistant of this settlement turned to the young man with a sweet smile and asked when he was going to deal with the mountain bandits. Hen continued to eat and said that there was no need to hurry as he planned to stay here for a few days and first make a plan to capture the thieves. These words made the interlocutor think that the guy could have been scared and came here just to show off. At that time, the chief among the mountain bandits came to the gray-haired ally and said that the second son had already arrived at In Hyun's stable. The man was amused by this news because he assumed that this young man had taken their bait, and now they would be able to deal with him one-on-one. A few days later, the farm owner was sitting at his table late at night, wondering if they were doing the right thing, since the thieves had not yet been punished. An assistant of the town came into the room and told him that today everything was going on as before. Nothing had changed, and no one was doing anything. The owner of the stable was even more upset because he did not know what to do next, because he could not drive away the second son of a respectable family for inactivity. When the assistant saw the master's condition, he was seriously angry because he was suffering so much because his horses had been stolen, and the young master did not care. As it turned out, every evening, the new leader and his soldiers held feasts where they drank heavily and had as much fun as they could. The servant of the leader of the Thunder Dragon army, holding several mugs, said that he would create a cocktail of 7 different kinds of drinks for the master. The young man carefully picked up the glass and brought it to his mouth and took one sip to see if this newly created drink was even drinkable. Having tasted it, he concluded that everything turned out very tasty, and the assistant who made it was happy and said that he would try to experiment further. The second son of a respectable family, taking another sip of the new drinks, said that the young man finally understood the taste of mixing these drinks. At that moment, the assistant of the settlement burst into the room, and he looked very angry. The young gentleman did not understand why this behavior at first. Then, he decided to defuse the situation and invited Mr. Ha to join them, saying that they would treat him to some delicious, newly created drinks. The guest gritted his teeth in anger and asked if Hen could send his subordinates out for a walk because they needed to talk to each other alone. This request upset the gentleman because it meant that the entertainment was over, but when everyone left, Ha asked how long this behavior would continue. The second son of a respectable family folded his hands on the table and said that he shouldn't talk to him like that because he had postponed everything until tomorrow because of the bitter cold. The guest emphasized that they had been hearing these words for a week, and the young man tried to explain that he could not stand the wild cold outside. The township assistant looked the other man in the eye and said that he wanted to know the real reason why the operation against the robbers was constantly postponed. Hen said that he had already said that it was because of the cold, but for some reason the guest did not believe this excuse, so he clarified again whether it was the only reason. Then the young man turned his head to the side and said that if he caught these mountain robbers, no one would give him anything valuable for it. Seeing the surprise on his interlocutor's face, the guy quickly got to his feet and smilingly said that he had just decided to make a joke. Then he went to the window and looked through it to the street and said that he wanted to rest a bit since he had come here because he would not have such a thing at home. The black-haired man was seriously angry at Heng's indifference, so he loudly banged his fists on the table and said that he was ready to give him money. In just a few minutes, the gentleman brought the young man a small chest, the contents of which he examined and said that he already had a desire to do something. The town clerk was both angry and saddened to have to give away the silver he had worked so hard to earn and save. The second son of a respected family did not pay attention to the sadness of the interlocutor. Instead, he said that he was very generous and he did not even know whether he could take it. The black-haired gentleman stretched his arms forward and said that he was being polite because he knew what the young leader was capable of for the sake of this town. This statement made the young gentleman very happy, and he complimented the settlement assistant that he was very generous for his character. Then Hen began to count the number of silver balls he had been given, but this began to irritate the guest, and he lightly coughed and asked if he had forgotten anything. In his mind, the black-haired man was thinking of finishing off this impudent man here and now, but he reminded himself out loud that he had to deal with the robbers. After this remark, the young gentleman quickly began to move towards the exit, explaining that he had completely forgotten about it, but was already going to catch them. For several hours, the carriage in which Hen, his troops, and the town's assistant had been traveling to the scene of the theft, and there was still a lot of snow on the street. Of course, the cold was bothering the second son of a respectable family, and so he tried to find out from the black-haired gentleman how far they still had to go. The interlocutor replied that he still had to move for a couple of hours, and then the young man said with a grimace that he was constantly feeling sick on trips. At this point, the township assistant had the urge to kill the guy right there, but he said with a slight smile that he would pay him afterwards. After this promise, the new leader closed the window to his carriage and said that he was ready to suffer everything. Hen was lying in his wagon, chewing on a snack, when he heard someone outside telling him that they were almost there, but that the wagon would not go any further. When the guy went outside, he began to stretch his whole body, which was stiff from one position, and then said that he was bored with the ride. The black-haired gentleman asked his partner to be quiet for a while, because there might be an ambush, and they should be careful. The boy began to look around, but did not notice anyone yet, but 2 men from the highest mountain were indeed watching them. One of them began to smile broadly, saying that these people do not even know that this road will lead them to their inevitable death. As soon as he finished speaking, the next phrase was spoken by an unknown voice, which said that they would most likely lose their lives. It turned out that the assistant leader of the Thunder Dragon army was sitting on a tree branch above them, folding his arms across his chest and smiling mysteriously. The men froze in their seats with their mouths wide open in surprise and fright, because they could not understand how they had been found so easily. Then the warrior jumped from the branch to the ground and found himself a few meters away from the two robbers who were still standing in the same position. However, as soon as they realized that they were about to be attacked, they began to talk to each other to develop a defense plan. However, before they had time to discuss anything, they drew their swords and began to run at the enemy with a quick step to be the first to strike. But this warrior has a lot of experience in fighting different opponents, so he easily managed to dodge the first blow they wanted to deal him. As soon as he was able to jump high up the hill, he began to smile with pleasure because he realized that his body was much lighter than before. After striking the robber, the soldier landed on the ground and suggested that this could be the result of training conducted by their new leader. The town assistant was a little alarmed by the sounds coming from them, but Hen, smiling, hurried to reassure them and said that they should not worry about it. After a short pause, the young man made a serious expression and told the interlocutor in a rude tone that his subordinates had caught the scouts. To put it mildly, Chornyavi was shocked by this news because he did not even expect that the young lord and his army would be at least capable of doing something, and here it is. Then the second son of a respectable family smiled again and said that he also had an observer who would be stronger than those who were watching them. At this time, the thought flashed through the township assistant's mind that this young man was not as stupid as he seemed at first glance, because he was acting strategically. When Jang Un came to his supervisor, he happily announced that he had killed all the spies at once. This news surprised even Hen himself, and his subordinate explained that he was a member of the glorious Thunder Dragon army. However, the Lord struck his warrior, reproaching him for leaving one to prepare for a fight with their enemy. The blow caused a large lump to appear on his head and tears of pain to appear in his eyes, but he decided to apologize for what he had done. For a few minutes, everyone present was just silent because no one wanted to be punished for saying something. But Chan Un had already gotten his chance to be in the vanguard. When everyone was moving along the forest paths, the assistant leader of the army was walking ahead of everyone else, who still had a headache from being hit by the leader. Suddenly, a few meters away, he showed everyone a sign to stop and be quiet, and then told his master that he could see the town ahead. After looking around, Hen concluded that this settlement could not even be called the home of the mountain bandits who had attacked so brazenly. In a second, the gentleman's thoughts were interrupted by the fact that he and his soldiers began to scream loudly throughout the forest from what happened next. After all, mountain bandits began to approach them from all sides, each of them holding his weapon and shouting loudly. The assistant of the second son of a respectable family turned her head slowly back and said to the gentleman that this was an ambush that was made for them. When she finished speaking, she saw that a township assistant was standing behind Heng, holding him by the body and putting the sharp tip of a knife to his throat and smiling slyly. The young lady was frozen in her tracks, but in a few seconds found the strength to ask what the black-haired man was doing. However, without waiting for an answer, the assistant gritted her teeth in anger and said that his poor family could never defeat the big Namgun family. The man chuckled a few times and then turned to his interlocutor and asked her if she still didn't understand what was happening here. A second later, he asked the girl to look around, and when she did, she realized that they were surrounded on all sides, and it was very bad. The black-haired man continued to hold the knife at Heng's throat and at the same time addressed everyone, saying that if they did not want to die, they should lay down their arms. The leader of the army and his comrade looked at each other because they remembered the leader's words about how if someone helps them, they have poison up their sleeve. While the two were talking so calmly, the main attacker could not understand why they were acting so relaxed in such a situation. Therefore, the assistant of the town decided to address everyone again and remind them that if they do not lay down their arms now, their master will be the first to be punished. But the man obviously did not expect what happened next, because the young gentleman calmly addressed the first line of his soldiers and told them to attack. And the rest of us should attack the traitor, but not take his life, but catch him alive, because that way we can sell him on the slave market. As soon as all the warriors of the Thunder Dragon army realized their task, they immediately began to fulfill it, scattering in different directions. As a result, a large-scale battle between two groups of troops broke out in a clearing in the middle of the forest, with each trying to destroy the other. In a few minutes, the warriors of the Thunder Dragon army began to win, and the assistant turned to the leader and said that they had this skill from training. Delivering another fatal blow to the enemy, the army chief said that he did not really want to admit it, but there was no other explanation. At that time, one group of rivals stood and watched the battle, and the results made it clear that they needed to unite because they were losing. However, the best friend of the leader of the Thunder Dragon army appeared on their way, and with a mysterious smile, he said that he was their rival. In a matter of seconds, the warrior was killing his opponents one by one, but in such a way that they would remain alive because they still needed them. When Hen's assistant watched the fight, she realized that her friend was mainly hitting people with other people, and it was hard to believe. A black-haired man, holding a knife at the young man's throat, began to say in a frightened voice that his people were completely stupid because they did not care about their master's life. The second son of a respectable family decided that it was time for him to be free, so he lightly touched the knife and threw it several meters away. Even the attacker himself was not prepared for such a trick, so he simply froze in place, and at that moment, the new manager began to quickly turn around to him. And as soon as he got to the distance he needed, he kicked him right in the sternum, and it was so hard that he flew backwards. But as it turned out later, he was not just flying, but there were moments when he touched the ground, rolled over, and continued to fly. When the attacker finally landed, he coughed loudly, and a small amount of white foam and saliva that had been in his mouth during the flight came out of his mouth. After that, the assistant rushed to her master because she was so happy that he had remained unharmed during the ambush. The young gentleman did not like such tenderness, so he held the young lady at arm's length, and at that moment he was informed that the fight was over. As soon as the beaten black-haired traitor came to, he looked at one point on the ground, because he realized that his entire plan was destroyed, of course, as was his entire life. As soon as the warriors of the Thunder Dragon army lined up all those responsible for the ambush in front of them, they realized that they did not need to be afraid of them at all. The leader of the army said in a serious tone that he did not believe that these people could attack in Hyun's stable and defeat the soldiers of a respectable family. The young man fully agreed with these words, but after a short pause, added that these attackers obviously have their leader hiding somewhere. After saying that, the guy slowly turned his head back and began to smile mysteriously, saying that as soon as you talk about a tiger, it will appear quickly. And as it turned out, they were indeed being approached by the gray-haired gentleman who was leading the whole parade and was intent on personally dealing with the young man. Heng put his right hand to his chin and looked at the man and asked why he was wearing a mask, since he didn't look like he was working as a clown. Suddenly, the best friend of the leader of the Thunder Dragon army began to move forward, telling everyone that he would deal with this gentleman himself. All of his colleagues tried to warn him, but he didn't want to listen to anything, because he was sure that he could behead this leader. The gray-haired gentleman who had just arrived did not even take these threats seriously, because he clearly understood that he had more strength than the attacker. When a warrior was flying at him with his sword drawn, the man calmly drew his weapon in order to resist and not appear weak. And of course, he was able to stop a punch that could have hit him right in the head, but it didn't, and that's why the attacker was a little shocked. A not-so-good thought flashed through his mind that this gray-haired gentleman had managed to stop his punch, and now he didn't know how to proceed to win. The leader's assistant said with a wide-open mouth in amazement that this gentleman was able to easily repel their strongman's attack, so it turns out that he was stronger. The strongman simply could not stop himself, so he again raised his weapon to try to strike again and called the gentleman a bastard. But again, he could not even wound his opponent, for the latter, in turn, touched the warrior's face with the sharp blade of his sword and managed to cut him. And when he took his weapon, he said that the attacker looked quite pathetic because he was trying so hard, but he was never successful. Then the man pointed a strange weapon at the strongman, which moved independently and hit him in different parts of the body, making it impossible to dodge. The young gentleman calmly watched this battle because that was the only way he could analyze all the techniques and find the weaknesses of the gray-haired man. After the terror, the warrior of the Thunder Dragon army held on to his weapon and breathed because he was tired of moving quickly. But the leader of the mountain bandits did not intend to stop there, so he came closer to his opponent and punched him in the stomach. All of the strongman's colleagues were shocked by what happened, to put it mildly, because after the blow, he fell to the ground and even dropped his axe. However, this was not the end of it, because the leader of the warriors had already appeared behind him and pointed his sword at the gray-haired man and said that he would not allow such an attitude. The man managed to react to this attack in time and quickly returned and repelled another attack, but this time from a different opponent. The main warrior did not like this very much, so he gritted his teeth in anger and called his opponent a bastard, which still needs to be searched for. At this time, the leader's assistant ran up to the strongman and put his hand on his stomach and asked if his colleague was alive and able to move. The victim slowly opened his eyes and sadly told the interlocutor that he was fine, but that his honor was slightly damaged and he felt bad about it. The leader, hearing the words of his best friend, said that he was not worried about his honor because this opponent could not be defeated alone. So the three lined up in a row and concluded that they needed to join forces and attack together to defeat this gray-haired monster. The attacker was a little amused by this decision and even laughed out loud, and then after a short pause told them to come over and not waste time. They immediately decided to stick to their strategy, so one attacked from the air and the other two had to attack simultaneously from different sides. However, the man realized that there was no point in using a sword this time, so he used a magical weapon that began to spread rapidly. The first injury was to the assistant leader of the Thunder Dragon Warriors, and he began to cough a little, and for some reason it became difficult to breathe normally. But then he was still able to put his two swords in front of his face, and this saved him from the light streams of the opponent's magical weapons, which were quite strong. When he decided to look ahead a little to see what was going on, the attacker's heel hit him in the face right then and there. It struck him quite hard, and he flew back several meters and immediately had no strength to get to his feet. When the comrades saw that their partner had been so brutally dealt with, they simultaneously decided to attack the gray-haired man who had been so cruel. However, they did not even succeed in doing so, as the gentleman was able to repel this brazen attack again, this time using his legendary sword. The best friend of the army leader still could not understand who this man was, because he simply could not be approached. The gray-haired gentleman had no intention of stopping there because he was tired of this showdown and wanted to get it over with as soon as possible. The other warriors of the Thunder Dragon army were shocked, to say the least, that this man could fight 3 people at once and not lose to them. And from this, the men began to conclude that this was not an ordinary mountain bandit, but the other bandits began to think that the gentleman would be able to destroy his attackers. After all, with each subsequent blow, he seemed to become stronger and more confident, while the attackers, on the contrary, were already losing ground and hardly attacked. However, the best comrade of the army leader could not accept the fact that he would have to surrender or die, so he fought with his last strength. For his last chance, the man took the idea that he could throw his axe at his opponent, and that this should somehow deal him a blow that would shake his confidence. However, everything did not happen as the strongman had imagined, because the gray-haired gentleman managed to deflect the sword with just one light swing of his sword. Then there was a short pause, and the robber called the last attacker a moron, who threw away his weapon without thinking about the consequences. The strongman was so unwilling to give up that he approached the man with quick steps and attacked him with his bare hands, trying to throw him to the ground. Again, he was unsuccessful because the main robber managed to stay on his feet, even though it required a lot of energy. The leader's best friend turned to his 2 partners and shouted for them to attack immediately, but they were in no hurry to do so. But then the leader realized that he simply would not have another chance, so he gained acceleration, jumped high, and began to fly at the gray-haired gentleman. He had already put his sword in front of him, and at the same time used some magic to defend himself, because he was not sure that he could successfully fight back. As soon as the head of the Thunder Dragon troops encountered this force, he received an electric shock and then flew back several meters. He landed on the ground, with his back to the ground, but he still managed to hold the sword in his hands, but continued to cough because he could not take a normal breath. Then the main robber raised the handle of his sword over the strongman who held it and said that their strategy was not bad, but they attacked the wrong person. At the end of the fight, he struck his opponent on the head, and it was so strong that he lost consciousness and just fell to the ground like a rubber band. A few minutes passed, and the warrior was able to regain consciousness, and a gray-haired gentleman was standing over him, holding his sword and telling him that he would have to destroy him. Then the attacker turned to the victim, who was lying on the ground, and asked him not to move much, because he would have to say goodbye to his life today anyway. The leader of the Thunder Dragon army froze in shock, as his best friend was now in mortal danger, and he could do nothing. However, the fatal blow never happened, because a small, thin stick flew into the sword blade and prevented the attacker from doing so. When the main robber saw what had prevented him, he turned to all those present and asked who dared to play such a bad joke on him. No one answered, but in a second, a young gentleman appeared in front of the man, who came without any weapons and felt quite confident. And for good reason, because in such cases, he does not need it at all, because he can strike with a clenched fist so hard that the gentleman will fly away. The subordinates opened their mouths wide again, for they could not even imagine that the young gentleman was so strong in his hands and brave in general. With his hands at his sides, Hen looked at the gray-haired gentleman, but at the same time turned to the strong man to ask if he was okay and could get up. After a pause, the second son of a respectable family explained that he did not do this because he felt sorry for his subordinate, because he was not capable of such a thing. Therefore, he added that until they bring some benefit to this world, they cannot die, even if they want to very much. Then the young gentleman ordered his subordinates to watch those who were unconscious while he went to deal with their leader. As soon as they locked eyes, Hen said that he was thinking about the fact that he had successfully attacked him by surprise, but he still managed to close at the last moment. Then the second son of a respectable family asked where this gentleman came from, because he did not look like a miserable and insolent mountain bandit. The interlocutor replied that the one who will soon die does not need to know this. The young gentleman put his hands to his sides and said that he was going to live for 100 years. Throwing his damaged sword aside, the gray-haired man confidently asked Hen if he could be so injured after just one blow. And putting both hands out in front of him, the masked man said that he would have to lower the bar a little bit and bring the young gentleman down from heaven to earth. The second son of a respectable family began to stretch his body parts because he realized that a fistfight might happen and he needed to warm up for that. To annoy his opponent a little, the young gentleman wagged his index finger and called to the gray-haired gentleman to come to him because he was waiting for something. This made the so-called robber very angry, so he called Hen a bastard and then began to approach him with quick steps. And so a fight broke out between them, in which each of them tried to behave with dignity, and at the same time strike, and sometimes successfully dodge them. Within a few minutes of the fight, the new leader of the Thunder Dragon Army concluded that this was no ordinary mountain bandit. During their clash, he used techniques that are rather obscure to ordinary people, and also used magic that enveloped his hands. Suddenly, Hen had the opportunity to hit his opponent in the face with his fist, and this blow damaged the mask on the gentleman's face. Wiping his busted lip, the chief of the robbers could not understand how it was that this young man was so confidently dodging his blows. The new leader pointed his finger at his rival and said that he was using the art of the dark dragon's blood claw and that he was the one who chose the bloody path. Hearing this assumption, the gray-haired man froze for a few seconds and then asked in a surprised tone how he knew such information about him. The young man explained that he felt an inner energy that was filled with evil intentions, but it is not yet known how he was able to complete the creation of this art. The gentleman just couldn't believe it, because he had just recently finished, and this guy managed to recognize this technique, and people with experience can do it. Then they began to smile mysteriously at each other, and at that moment, the older man thought that he was rested enough to continue. So he decided to use his new technique because Hen had already guessed about it, and there was no point in hiding it and not using it to its fullest. The expression on the young gentleman's face showed that he was not at all afraid of this manifestation. Instead, he clarified that the gentleman had decided to go all in. Spreading his energy around, the gray-haired gentleman emphasized that the second son of a respectable family had forced him to do this right here and now. Whenever an enemy's energy stream tried to touch Hen and harm him, he skillfully managed to avoid the collision,